Sorry about that. Just wanted to make sure that we are recording. So welcome to today's virtual training workshop. We are being recorded. It is October 27th. My name is Alyssa Atkins, and I am the Training and Development Coordinator. I will be your training facilitator today. If you are coming off of the web browser, your screen should look similar to this one right here. You have the option to click the camera icon on or off. I have noticed that you have better connection if your camera is turned off. I will continue to keep my camera turned off just so Vincent can go on without being interrupted or any glitching, but just know that I am here. You also have access to your microphone. Please make sure that whether you are coming in the room or leaving the room, to make sure to leave your microphone muted. At the end, Vince or during, Vince will ask if you have any questions. At that time, you are more than welcome to turn on your mic and ask your question, or leave it in the chat box and I will make sure Vince answers your question. And with that being said, you also have the chat function. All questions, any IT problems should all go here. If you're coming off of the app, you have a couple more options, but the main three important ones for the virtual training are going to be your camera, microphone, and the chat function. Here is the link for the materials, and I will also go ahead and post that in the chat box for you to go ahead and grab all the materials. With that being said, I'm going to stop sharing, and Vince, would you like to begin?
I would, and thank you for the introduction. Before I get going, did you want to say, did you want to say anything about Crystal?
Oh, yes. So today was supposed to be Crystal and Vince's virtual training. Crystal is very upset that she could not be here for today's training. She is feeling a little bit under the weather, but she really did want to be here and just wanted everyone to know that she worked really hard to be here today. And it is very unfortunate that she could not be able to do the virtual training with Vince. They have worked a very long time over this, and everything was thought out very carefully.
Follow the point about Rose. At this point, everyone needs to mute their microphone, if you would, so we're not getting all kinds of different conversations. There's several people, and really the only microphone that should be open is Ovista and or myself as we move forward, unless you have a question or concern. But if you wouldn't mind muting, that would be very helpful. Thank you, everyone. All right, I'm just going to go ahead. Yes, it's very, very unfortunate that Crystal is not feeling well today. She played a huge part in this program and putting this together basically over the past year or more, working with myself, more than a year, working with myself, putting together all of the different components as well, from an instructional standpoint. And also, from a marketing standpoint as well, and all the logistics, putting this together. So I know she's greatly upset. She wanted to be here. And as was mentioned a few moments ago, she was going to play a very big part in the, in the presentation itself. But that's okay. You're all here and we're going to move forward with this. I've got a lot of information to present to you. I'm on the screen right now. Hopefully you can see me and hear me right now, but in a minute I'm going to close my camera because I'm going to bring up the presentation to show you. I'm going to be doing a review, but I want to welcome everyone, and those of you that have been with me before in this presentation, in particular the webinars that we did last week. There were 4 of them last week that play a part of this. If you were in that webinar, any one of those webinars, then the material that we're going to be going over, or I'm going to be going over for the next 60 minutes or so, 60 to 90 minutes, is going to be a review for you. For those of you that were not in any of the webinars last week, or just a couple of them, then this might be new information. So I'll be sure to touch on the highlights of each of the areas when I get into that in a few minutes. But what I was going to say is, those of you that have seen me before may recognize that my background's a little bit different. I too am working with some illnesses here. My twin sons that were in their 30s, and one of them got bitten the other day, he thinks, by none other than the infamous brown recluse spider on his left arm. And before you knew it, it turned into something much more alarming. We had to rush him to the hospital, and he ended up with a staph infection throughout his whole body, and the next step would have been MRSA. We thought he would have to go into surgery on his arm, but it turns out that they had put him on hardcore antibiotic IVs, which seemed to help quite a bit. Discharged him yesterday, got him home, and he is convalescing here at mom and dad's house for the next couple days. So, and then my wife got sick too just yesterday. Laura got sick. Um, and so everyone, well, except myself, knock on wood, I'm healthy, and we're here. We're going to get through this program today. So again, thank you for all being here today. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, because what I'm going to do is, I mentioned, I'm going to do a review going over each webinar that was presented last week, 4 of them. The first one was on Tuesday, Wednesday. It was on Monday of last week, and that was on NAHASDA legislation. So that's going to be the first part of the review. I'll go over that. The second webinar, which was Tuesday of last week, was on HUD's Native American Housing Activities 24 CFR Part 1000. That was Tuesday's webinar, and that's going to be the second part of the review I'll do today. And then Wednesday and Thursday of last week was a tag team where I went over OMB's uniform guidance to CFR Part 200 regulations. Wednesday was subparts A, B, and C, and Thursday were subparts D, E, and F. And that's going to be the kind of the second half of the review. So, if you were with us last week, that's great. You should be right on top of these issues. If this is new to you, don't worry about it. You're in the right place. We're going to go over the NAHASDA legislation and the important parts of it. And then we're going to go, it's all important, but highlights of it. And then the 24 CFR Part 1000, which is HUD's housing activities, and then follow up with the OMB uniform guidance. So hopefully I can do this. I'm going to share my screen, try to.
It's going to be the share button right next to the leave. And it should ask you if you'd like to do your, yes.
Can you see it?
Yes, but it looks like you're editing right now.
Full screen?
Not yet. Give it 1 second to load. No, it's still the editing.
Mine is full screen.
Okay.
What I see.
It may be just lagging.
Try again.
It's still
You
the
should be.
editing.
Okay. Well, even if it's the editing version, hopefully you can follow with me. And at some point, the system will catch up. What I see in front of me is full screen of the PowerPoint presentation, and hopefully at some point you'll be able to see it as well. And bear with me as we go through it. Technology is a wonderful thing when it works, and when it doesn't, you just got to deal with it. Always, if you let me know when you go full screen, I would appreciate it, because
Okay.
I see it as full screen, and hopefully it'll catch up.
Have you tried clicking from beginning?
That's what I did.
Okay. Then yeah, it probably just needs a second to load, but I will let you know the minute that it is the presenting screen.
All right, now I'm going to move forward with it, because hopefully you'll be able to see what I'm talking about, even if it's not full screen on your end. As I mentioned a moment ago, what I'll be talking about in the first part of the review here is what I'm referring to as part one, navigating, reviewing, interpreting the legislation, which is the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996, which is commonly referred to its acronym NAHASDA, which was implemented during the Clinton administration back in 1996. And then you can see underneath it, hopefully part two, part three, and part four. That was the information that was presented during the webinars last week and what I'll be reviewing. But let's start with part one here, which is the NAHASDA. What I'm going to do over the next few slides is give you an update on the important features of the NAHASDA legislation, in particular how it relates to housing, Native American housing, low-income housing, and just go from there. Very first objective, NAHASDA was created to assist and promote affordable housing for Native American communities. Also to create, excuse me, better access to mortgage markets, also to promote self-sufficiency. One of its most important benefits and features is just that, to promote self-sufficiency, also to plan and integrate infrastructure. Another very important part is to support infrastructure with the Native American communities. Also to promote private capital markets is another one. We are going to also talk about, here's another overview, there are several titles within the NAHASDA. I tend to focus more on Title I and Title II. Title I being block grant requirements, in particular the Indian Housing Block Grant known as the IHBG. Also, Title II is included in the NAHASDA legislation, which refers to affordable housing activities. Title III is allocation of grant amounts and how that is done. Basically, the allocation of grant amounts is a very complicated mathematical formula that is done from time to time, but there's a lot of steps, a lot of moving parts. And that's briefly explained or pointed out in Title III of NAHASDA. Title IV refers to compliance, audits, and reports. Title IV, those three areas, compliance, audits, and reports, as you can imagine, is a very, very important part that carries over into the regulations. Here we're talking about the legislation, okay? It's at the top of the pyramid. If you can imagine a pyramid, at the very top, you've got the NAHASDA legislation written in, congressional language, legal jargon, but it sits at the very top of the pyramid, telling those that are interested and those that it applies to, how to put together what is eligible, and it often is cross-referenced to the regulations that we're going to be looking at in a few minutes, in particular 24 CFR Part 1000, which deals with housing issues, and 2 CFR Part 200, which is OMB's uniform guidance. OMB is Office of Management and Budget. If any organization receives federal funds, then they have to abide by the regulations that are contained in the uniform guidance, often referred to as 2 CFR Part 200. It also sometimes, although this is fading now that it's been active for several years now, it's also sometimes referred to as the super circular, 2 words. But you hear that less and less these days. That's kind of the street name for it. But all of these things, the legislation and those 2 major regulations, all tie together when it comes to housing activities for Native American communities, and in particular for low-income housing. So, and that's specifically what the HUD's 24 CFR Part 1000 talks about. When we get to that document, you'll see that it references NAHASDA and it also references the uniform guidance. So it's three documents in particular that are kind of interwoven together, and you've got to be familiar with not just the legislation, you've got to be very, very familiar with both of those documents, both of those regulation documents to be able to operate efficiently and effectively. So Title IV there references compliance, audits, and reports. You're
Hey,
going to
Ben.
see, yeah. Yeah.
We're still seeing that edit, and I can't see any of the slides. I just see the very first one. Is there any way that you could try turning off your camera and let's see maybe if that'll help?
Okay.
And maybe we can try clicking the from beginning
Okay.
or
Okay. Good. Right, hold on. Camera's going off. Okay. Microphone's still on. Okay.
and the little button right under file where it says from beginning or from current slide, sorry.
Okay, from current slide. Let me get it back up as soon as I can.
Hey Vince, this is G. What do you think about Owisa sharing her screen and you just tell her to advance the slides?
We can do that too. We can do that too. That'll work just as well. If you have my PowerPoint, try that. Sure.
I can pull up your PowerPoint right now.
Okay.
In the meantime, do you want to try and share your screen, and I will let you know the second I have the PowerPoint up?
Absolutely. Okay, we're going to go back to trying to share the screen. Okay. Bear with me, folks. We'll get there. Okay. Got that. Okay, here we go. Share. Okay. How about that? Can you see that?
Yeah, we see it, but it's still in edit mode. Are you able to advance your slides? Because we're still on the first slide.
Try clicking.
How about that? I'm moving. I have full screen and I'm moving the slides forward. Seeing any of the slides progress?
No, it's still the very first one.
Okay. Well, yeah, maybe that's a better idea for you to put it up on your end if you can.
Oh, we're now on the NAHASDA overview slide, so seem to be making progress.
Which overview slide do you see?
That's just the title of the slide. It says NAHASDA overview.
Okay.
Title 1 block grant requirements.
Right. Okay. I see title 6, 7, 5, 6, and 7.
Yes. Can you
Okay.
click the button that says from current slide?
Yep.
See if that works.
All right, I did, and I have full screen. Are you seeing full screen?
We're still seeing the editing, but
Just take it from that slide you're on, Vince. We'll go ahead and keep it moving.
Yeah, works for me. Okay. But you're seeing it as a present. You're not seeing full screen though, correct?
No.
I'm gonna go to what you're seeing, the version you're seeing. All right. Now, hopefully you're seeing NAHASDA overview 5, 6, and 7. Okay, because that's kind of where we are now. We talked about 1, 2, 3, and 4. I want to keep moving on. Hopefully you're seeing Title 5, Title 6, Title 7 of the NAHASDA overview, 5 being termination of assistance under uncorporated programs. Hopefully you're never in that situation where we're talking about terminations, even though it's addressed in the NAHASDA. It's something that, hopefully you're not going to find yourself in. Number 6 is federal guarantees for financing tribal housing activities, and Title 7 of NAHASDA gets into other housing assistance. Title 8, housing assistance for Native Hawaiians. We're not going to be talking about that issue today, but it does include that in the NAHASDA legislation. One of the things that's done not only in the legislation, but also in the regulations is what's called negotiated rulemaking. It's a common process for as I mentioned, not only legislation, but the regulations, people coming together, leadership, tribal leadership, and other authorities from different agencies, HUD in particular, when it comes to housing activities, coming together and meeting and discussing the legislation from time to time. And also, same thing applies to the regulations. Negotiated rulemaking is just that. As you can imagine, it's kind of a back and forth discussion of the regulations and legislation, more the regulations these days. They tend to change more not a lot and not frequently, but more frequently than the legislation. So that's what negotiated overview of negotiated rulemaking is, coming together as a group from time to time and going over and making sure that in particular the regulations are appropriate. We saw that not too long ago when the uniform guidance came out with an update. It went through a negotiated rulemaking process, and a lot of and we'll get to that in a few minutes, but there were a lot of small changes in there. Usually it's not a dramatic type of thing. It's usually a series of small changes that occur. But it's important to know that how this comes about. Negotiated rulemaking is a phrase that's often used throughout these documents. You'll see it. It's referred to quite often. Authorized federal, we talked about that. Reauthorizes the NAHASDA reauthorized the Indian Housing Loan Guarantee Program. It extended household interest in trust and restricted land from housing purchases to 50 years, or what's kind of what they consider to be the life expectancy. That's where, I don't know where the 50-year came from, but that seems to be what's referred to as usable life for expectancy, in particular for housing. So it also expanded affordable housing opportunities in general, and it specifically addresses families who are above and below low income. It gave some criteria for federal agencies like HUD that trickle down to the recipients like us, the tribal entities and others, an idea where low income should be calculated. And it's different depending upon the area that you live in, the state you live in, the metropolitan area, and some of the other demographics. Okay, so let's keep moving on here. Block grant, in particular, Indian Housing Block Grant, is used to operate and maintain current housing units. That was established through the NAHASDA legislation, used for development, for new construction, for rehabilitation, acquisitions, support services, and some other things. Counseling, loan processing, as you probably saw in some of the features that are part of NAHASDA, as well as initiating model housing programs. Part of the program part of the legislation that was approved in NAHASDA is what was referred to as a model activity, which is something that is outside, kind of out of the norm, kind of outside of a traditional housing entity. But housing model activity is something that's approved through the NAHASDA legislation, and it carries throughout the regulations as well. And I talked about the Indian Housing Block Grant as being the contributor. So that's just a couple, just wanted to touch on a couple things with NAHASDA and then move into the next area. Again, if you have any questions, be sure to indicate, let me know. We can stop at any time. But if I don't hear any, or if Alista doesn't interrupt me with a question or concern that comes from you folks, then I'll keep moving on. So the next area that we talked about last week during the webinars was the review of part 2. This was on Tuesday of last week, navigating, reviewing, interpreting the regulations. Now we moved from the legislation over to the first part of the regulations, and that was in particular HUD's Native American Housing Activities, also known as 24 CFR Part 1000. A lot of, we spent a lot of time on Tuesday talking about these regulations and guidelines that pertain to housing. What's unique about the Native American Housing Activities document is it's written in a question and answer format, where NAHASDA itself is legislation, and the latter part, the OMB's uniform guidance, is written as more like a legal document. But this one's a little different. It's written like a question and answer. It's broken into 6 subparts, but it's a question and answer type of thing. It's a very unique document. Not all of them are written that way. So 24 CFR Part 1000 overview, as I mentioned, 6 subparts. So the 6 subparts is very similar to the other regulation we'll be talking about, the uniform guidance, 6 subparts. In this document, subpart A of 24 CFR Part 100 talks about NAHASDA's primary objectives. So if you're familiar with the legislation, you should be familiar with at least part and parcel of subpart A. It talks about the legal authority of the regulation, which comes from NAHASDA. It talks about the federal laws that come from NAHASDA. NAHASDA is federal law, so everything that's generated in it is considered to be law. It also talks extensively about conflict of interest. And you see, if you're not familiar with conflict of interest, you should be, because this is something that carries through this document and into the next document, the other regulations we'll be talking about. It's a very important operational perspective on many levels, is trying to mitigate or lessen any possibility of a conflict of interest. Now, conflict of interest is an open-ended statement, but there's several and lots of examples of it. But what's unusual about conflict of interest is there's no uniform set of criteria for it. It's unique to every organization. Every organization, if it's a conflict of interest for a housing entity, might be different for some other type of organization. So this is where it's very, very important to understand the operation of your organization, the clientele that you are trying to satisfy, and the regulations here to make sure that you don't have conflict of interest in any way, shape, or form. Subpart A also talks about key terms. All right. Subpart B talks about, specifically gets into affordable housing activities and several focus areas. First one being the regulations and amendments to implement affordable housing activities. I can tell you now that you want to make sure you've got the most recent version of the 24 CFR Part 1000, because it's been revised through that revision process that I mentioned earlier several times. Now, it hasn't been revised lately, even though there's been talk about it over the years, but there's been several changes. And I think the last one was done a good 10 or 11 years ago. I want to say 2010, and I can check that real quick. 2010 was the last time that it was updated completely. Yes, 2010 is the version. It hasn't changed dramatically, if at all, since that time. So you want to make it, but it has gone through revision. So you want to make sure that when you're looking at the actual document, and by the way, you want to, since we're talking about legislation and since we're talking about the regulations, this one in particular and the one coming up and the NAHASDA, please make sure that you have a copy of each one of these documents in front of you, on literally on your desk, on your workstation, both hard copy and probably electronic version of each one of these. I have found that the best place to go to get all of these documents is, in particular, the regulations, is a website, ecfr.gov. So basically, E as in electronic, CFR .gov. And once you go to that site, you can put in there 24 CFR Part 1000 or 2 CFR Part 200 or any other of the titles or any other of the regulations, and you can download what I consider to be a usable friendly version. It's a lot easier to understand. We had this discussion last week on Wednesday and Thursday when we were talking about the next set of regulations, the uniform guidance written in what's referred to as the Federal Register, which is the government's version of the document. And it looks like a newspaper because it has 3 columns with very, very small print, and it's very difficult to read. You go from left to right, but you have to follow the columns from top to bottom, and it can get very, very confusing, especially if you're looking at it electronically on your laptop or on your desktop. It's difficult to follow. So what I recommend is that you go to ecfr.gov or any other site that works for you, so you can print out versions of the legislation, correct versions, and up-to-date and versions of the regulations, and have them in electronic format so you can cut and paste the document when you need to cite a certain area of the regulations, and also have it in your desktop or literally on your desk as a hard copy. I did that for a number of years, and I don't think a work day went by that I didn't reference or felt a comfort level with having those documents in front of me, because they are the go-to documents for any type of Native American housing activities. So I would suggest that you have those documents in front of you. So subpart B also talks about eligible activities, which is very, very important. What type of housing activities are eligible? Eligible beneficiaries, who's eligible for it. Cost and payment limits. This is also something you need to be aware of and get into detail. There's a lot of information that's contained in that document that breaks down the cost payments. This is subpart B, 24 CFR Part 1000, HUD's Native American housing activities. It also includes existing housing stock going back to the old regulations. It references that. So something to be very familiar with. Subpart C gets into the IHP, the Indian Housing Plan, the preparation, the submission process, the review, the tribes or who's ever responsible for submitting the Indian Housing Plan. It goes into the particulars of when it's due, the information that's contained in it. Also, if you're using Indian Housing Block Grant funds, you're going to have to submit an Indian Housing Plan referred to as an IHP, and there's certain information. Nowadays, there's been a metamorphosis with the IHP and its partner, the APR, the Annual Performance Report. They go hand in hand. The IHP is the report that's submitted to HUD prior to the start of your fiscal year. It basically tells HUD what you're going to do for using the money that you're eligible for within your program year. It tells HUD what you're going to do, how you're going to use it, and to the dollar where you're going to spend your money. The APR at the back end, it tells HUD what you did. And hopefully those two reports match up, not only in what you're doing in the data that you're providing, but also in the dollar amount that you're using. Okay, those reports are important. And there's been another metamorphosis with this over the years. The Indian Housing Plan has morphed over the years. It used to be a Word document, then it morphed into an Excel sheet type of document, and then most recently it has changed again. It's progressed into an online data-driven type of report these days. It's referred to, HUD refers to it as its EPIC system, EPIC, which is a very long phrase, but that is the system that's referred to now. And they're even talking about a second generation of that, moving from the EPIC to another type of system. But basically what that is, it's becoming more and more data driven than it ever was before. And that's because the requirements of data-driven information is becoming more and more prevalent. That's talked about in the next section, the 2 CFR Part 200. In one of the subsections of that, it talks about all the federal agencies, including HUD, moving more and more to performance-based activities and data-driven activities. So, and information being presented to them from the recipient, that's us, sometimes referred to as a non-federal entity or an NFE, more and more pressure put on the federal agencies to have their recipients of their funding provide more and more data and performance data instead of, you know, the traditional verbiage. So that's the transition we're going through now, and that's what it's not spelled out here in subpart C of the 24 CFR Part 1000. It just gives you some of the parameters. Where it's spelled out in more detail is the next set of regulations that we'll get to in a few minutes. The 2 CFR Part 200, where it talks about performance initiatives, data-driven. That's all part of those regulations. But remember, these all intertwine together. All right. NAHASDA requires that the tribe submit an IHP prior to the recipient of IHBG funds, and that is, you know, it's in these regulations. It's also in NAHASDA that reports have to be generated before and during and after. That follows through all 3 of these documents, all the legislation and the 2 major regulations, reporting, self-monitoring, IHP, which is the pre-award data-driven document, and then the APR, which is the post-award. It all, keep in mind those phrases, pre-federal award and post-federal grant award. Those are all terms that are used throughout these documents. And what they're talking about in this particular document is the Indian Housing Block Grant in particular. All right, keep going. So Part D gets into the allocation formula that I kind of alluded to before. It talks about the process, the negotiated rulemaking that I alluded to before. It talks about the formula itself, although it doesn't tell you how that the allocation formula comes about. But the Indian Housing Block Grant is an allocated formula federal grant award. It's not competitive. It's based on an allocation formula. And every tribe is different based on its census, based on its demographics, based on the information that it provides to HUD in this case. The allocation formula is a very sophisticated math formula with a lot of moving parts to it. I'm not going to go into the actual process. That would be a whole training in itself of the allocation formula and the components. But every entity that is eligible and or receives Indian Housing Block Grant funds has an allocation formula. It is sent to you. You can see it. It's several pages long. It usually comes to you before the award comes. before the actual dollars are available to you, you should be receiving something from your ONAP office, Office of Native American Programs, which is a subdivision of HUD. You should be getting a document that really breaks down the allocation formula for your particular entity, and you'll see that it's some 20, 25 pages of formulas and calculations and demographics and census and all kinds of different information. But it's there for you to take a look at, the allocation formula breakdown. Subpart E gets into federal guarantees for financial tribal housing, terms and conditions, which HUD will guarantee the obligations issued to the recipient. So basically, subpart E is more geared towards the agencies and not so much us as the recipients. These subpart E talks about the requirements that HUD in particular has to meet and has to go through in its process of generating Indian Housing Block Grant funds to us as the recipient. So subpart E, not so much to us, it's more for the agencies. Subpart F, on the other hand, is very driven towards us as recipients. In fact, it talks extensively about reporting, compliance, oversight, accountability, reporting, the self-monitoring process. If you haven't heard of the phrase self-monitoring, you're going to see that a lot in the next section, the next set of regulations, and it's something that needs to be done. It's not only required that you do a self-monitoring process if you receive Indian Housing Block Grant, it's required, and it's a good best practice to have in place. It's basically an internal audit that you do of your program, of your Indian Housing Block Grant funds, to make sure that you have the three most important things in place and you have internal controls for these three things. Your operation, that's the first one. Your financial statements, your financial transactions, basically your financial condition. And thirdly, your compliance. Those are the three pillars that hold up the organization: operation, finance, compliance. Self-monitoring, as part of the self-monitoring of compliance and performance report in that bullet, looks at all of those three areas and makes sure that each of those three areas have internal controls in the form of policies and procedures that meet the federal guideline, meet or exceed the federal guidelines and all applicable best practices, basically. So we'll talk about that in the review of the next section when we get into the uniform guidance, right? We'll get into more detail because that regulation gets into allowable and unallowable expenditures and gets into more of the nitty-gritty of what you can actually do and can't do, where you can spend your money. Got me so far? Okay, moving along. That's subpart F, and that refers to monitoring compliance, the reports that we were just talking about, reviews, audits, what's commonly referred to as the single audit. That's the specific audit that is performed, that is required to be performed if you receive over $750,000 per year, per your fiscal year, per your program year in federal funds. You're required to have an audit. There's also tribal reviews, audits, internal audits that can be done. It refers to all of those things. And lastly, as you can see, remedies for non-compliance. It's a phrase I dread saying. It's a phrase that you should never hear on your end of operating your entity, and that is problems associated with non-compliance. You should never be in that situation because of the training that you're receiving here, the self-monitoring that you're doing or should be doing or have been doing, in the internal reports, the internal controls that are mandated. We'll talk about that in the next section. Internal controls that translate into policies and procedures. If you have an understanding of NAHASDA legislation, if you have an understanding of the 6 components of the 24 CFR Part 1000, and also the next set of regulations, the 2 CFR Part 200, you should, if you have a good understanding of those 3 documents and how they intertwine together, then you should never be in a situation where you're dealing with remedies for noncompliance, because that can have terrible repercussions. It could mean the delay of your funding if noncompliance is recognized by an auditor or program review. It could end up in your debarment, which means you cannot receive funds for a period of time or forever. There's all kinds of terrible things that could be associated with noncompliance, and it's something that we want to make sure we're never in that situation. So enough said on that. So here just are some examples, key regulations and compliance criteria within the different subparts of 224 CFR Part 1000, the housing, Native American housing activities. The first group that I talked about a couple slides ago were the 0 to 99, 2 CFR Part 1000.110 through, in this picture here, 54. You can see it talks about at the top, I'm at the top right there. 1000.10 talks about definitions, something you should be familiar with. All the phrases, all the acronyms, all the definitions that are common. And folks in this industry, with between the legislation and the regulations we have to deal with, we're full of acronyms. So you need to understand what all these words and phrases mean. And even more when we get into the next set of regulations, okay, including accessibility. 1014, so we're talking subpart A here. We're talking at the very beginning. Talks about relocation, real property acquisition. Number 16 is important. It talks about labor standards. Take a note on this one, labor standards. We're going to talk, that's going to carry over into the next section. It was talked about in the NAHASDA because when you start using federal dollars for construction and rehabilitation, if it's over a certain dollar amount, in this case, $2,000 or more, you get into another set of legislation that you have to abide by and a whole nother set of regulations. It's referred to as Davis-Bacon legislation. You may want to write that one down. Davis-Bacon legislation is the law, and then there are regulations that come with it, kind of like what we're doing here, but geared exclusively for labor, what's also called prevailing wage, certified payroll records. We get into all of that when we get into construction, using the trades, construction trades, or rehabilitation over using federal funds, Indian Housing Block Grant included, $2,000 or more. We get into that whole area. More on that in the next part, but labor standards is a very, very important part of the process, especially the construction and rehabilitation process of buildings, new or rehab. Okay, so it talks there a little bit about labor standards, more on that in the next section. 18 talks about environmental review requirements, quite a few issues on environmental reviews. All right, 26 gets into the administrative requirements, in particular procurement. We'll talk more about that. There's more detail. Here it talks about the requirements of having procurement and competition in place. In the next section, the next set of regulations, we get into the nitty-gritty. It defines how to do procurement, what are the limits, what are the processes, and gives you more exact detail. Here, it's just an overview, not so much detail, other than there's a requirement for competition. There's a requirement that you have a procurement process in place. Internal controls, that's under your financial area, and it overlaps into operation and compliance. But procurement means everything that you purchase, every expenditure that you have, whether it's salary for your staff, or whether you're buying parts for the office, or you're buying equipment for construction or rehabilitation, as in tools and all that kind of thing. Procurement covers everything. All right. There's conflict of interest again, and there's several. You can see 30 through 34. So 30, 31, 32, 33, and 34 in that subpart A talks more definition of conflict of interest. So take a look at that, make sure everyone understands what conflict of interest could entail. Record retention is 36. Now, regulations require 3 years. That's what's stated throughout the documents, even in the next set of regulations. But you probably know better, as much as I do, that 3 years just doesn't cut it. You're going to have to retain your records, whatever they are, whatever your records are, probably much longer than that. 5 years, even 7 years is recommended for the IRS. Now, if you're going to have some kind of an audit or a program review, here's the honest truth. The federal agencies simply don't have the manpower, the people power to be able to do the program reviews on a timely basis. So what might happen is you might have a program review that comes 2 or 3 or 5 years, hopefully not that long, after you've closed the program. It could happen. So you need to make sure that your record retention is in place, whether you have hard copy or whether you have electronic version or a combination of the two. You need to be able to have internal controls and policies and procedures that define how long you're keeping your records, who has access to them, and what they are, and where you keep them. If it's hard copy, you're going to have a physical location, and you're probably going to have some kind of locking mechanism, literally a locking mechanism. If they're electronic versions, there's going to have to be some mechanism built in where they're only accessed by a limited amount of people. In this industry, ONB in the next set of documents refers to that as personally identifiable information. You may want to write that phrase down. It's known as PII, personally identifiable information. The regulations here and in the next set of regulations require that we maintain those records kind of, like a Fort Knox. We need to protect that information. We need to retain it. We need to protect it. So whether it's hard copy or electronic, you need to figure out a way that that information is retained, that it's considered confidential. And it could be different for each organization, right? It could be different because it's a combination of different things. It could be a combination of a social security number along with a date of birth and a name and a marital status, or a passport number, or a prison record, or a medical health record, all kinds of different documents, including biometrics these days, where they're taking fingerprints and eye retina scans. Those are referred to as biometrics, which give information, potentially electronic information. We need to find ways to protect that. We need to work with our IT departments to make sure the electronic versions are safeguarded. We need to make sure that we have internal controls and policies and procedures that, one, recognize that there are records that need to be retained and personally identifiable information that needs to be warehoused, and that you have mechanisms in your policies and procedures that protect that information. Okay, enough on that, because there's more in the next set of regulations that give even more definition. And 45 through 54, several areas there on Indian preference, tribal preference, that type of thing. All right, keep going. Now we moved into the 100. So in subpart B, that gets into affordable housing specifically. As you can see in the columns, it gets into eligible affordable housing activities, more definition there. Gets into tenant and project-based rental assistance, if you're going to do that. It gives definition on that. And also the next one talks about eligible families, including admissions and occupancies. I know the Native Learning Center has given training sessions on admissions exclusively on the regulations on admissions and occupancies. There's quite a bit of information that needs to be understood. I could spend the whole day. Actually, I'm not an expert on admissions and occupancy, to be quite honest with you. There are other subject matter experts that have much more expertise. My point is, I could spend all day or maybe a series of days talking just on this topic, admissions and occupancy, as it relates to eligibility for families and housing in tribal, low-income tribal housing. So that is critically important. That is one you need to get familiar with. Also, to carry on, families requiring HUD approval, that's a section. 110 gets in into more conditions on low-income housing. 120 gets into more on tribal Indian preference and tribal preference, so including more information on admissions and occupancy. So I want to put this in here. That's just the two most important parts. I wanted to bring that out to you in the 24 CFR Part 1000. Look, I want to show you this. Hopefully you can see this pyramid here. It's a blue pyramid. If you can't see it, just visualize it. It's a small pyramid, and it's got some arrows pointing to it. And what I'm talking about here is all of the legislation and regulations. You can have a visual as being the pyramid. Talked about this a little earlier. At the very top, you've got the legislation. Then underneath that, you've got the regulations. The next bigger part, because they get into more and more detail. Then underneath that, you've got even another level. We're not going to get into, we simply don't have the time to get into all the even more detailed PIH notices and program guidances and other things that are coming directly from the funding source. In our case, it would be from the EWONAP Office of Native American Programs, that give even more definition from time to time on some of the regulations or updates on information. And then at the very bottom of the pyramid there, but it's the bottom, but it's very, very important. And that is your own internal controls within your organization. Internal controls that I told you about the three areas, the most important areas for internal controls, and that is operation, financial, and compliance, right? Those are the three internal controls pillars. Then each one of those pillars of internal controls need to have policies and procedures. So you only might have a few internal controls, but you're going to have numerous policies and procedures based on a couple things, based on the legislation and the regulations, and also based on the uniqueness of what you do and how you operate your entity, right? So that's the pyramid. Keep that in mind. That's the administrative flow. So we've talked about the legislation, and we've talked about the first round of regulation in the 24 CFR Part 1000, which is HUD's Native American housing activities. The next one I want to bring forward to you over the next 30 minutes we have here of the review process is getting into even deeper level of regulation, and that is the Part 3 and Part 4, as you hopefully can see at the bottom of the slide there. Navigating, reviewing, and interpreting the regulations, in this case, looking at the uniform guidance, OMB's uniform guidance, referred to as 2 CFR Part 200. Wednesday, we talked about this, subparts A, B, and C. And then Thursday, we went into D, E, and F. And I'll be honest with you, D, E, and F hold the most meat of, and I think, in my opinion, where kind of the rubber meets the road. D, E, and F get into a lot of things that affect our daily operation in housing and as recipients of the Indian Housing Block Grant. And I'll show you what I mean by that. There's all kinds. So bear with me as we move through the next set of regulations that are pertinent to what we do. Now, I went over a few things. This is Wednesday and Thursday of last week during the webinars. I want to mention a couple things to you that came through the Trump administration, but carried over into the Biden administration. It's referred to as supporting implementation of the president's management agenda and other administrative priorities. Basically, these are executive orders that went in place during the Trump administration that trickled down into the federal regulations, in particular, the regulations that pertain to any organization receiving federal funding, including the Indian Housing Block Grant. So that's going to be us. The first one is buying domestic. It's referred to as support for domestic preferences for procurement. Now, that probably makes a lot of sense, you know, by domestic. Okay, we live in the United States, da da da. You know, that makes sense. But this was an executive order that put some stipulations on by domestic for procurement. O&B, and you can see, hopefully see the word encourages. It's not a mandate, but it's encouragement of the maximum use of goods, products, and materials produced in the United States. So by domestic, that could be an issue for some tribes that border Canada. There are a couple tribes that do that in upstate New York and other tribes across the, you know, across that divide. But you know, that's something they're going to have to be aware of. So if you, or down south too. So if you're bordering Mexico, if you're bordering Canada, you need to be aware that this regulation exists. But at this point, the Biden administration and O&B have not pushed it to the requirement, with the exception of 2 CFR Part 200, 321. All right, that's literally in that set of regulations, all right, that we're going to be talking about. It's where we get into some, unfortunately, house building, infrastructure building materials, iron, steel, cement. Now, cement, if you know this or not, cement is really an aggregate of several products, sand, stone, and other, a lot of times, other proprietary ingredients. So cement is really a conglomerate of different products, but cement in general, products include aluminum, plastics, polymer-based products, such as polyvinyl pipe, that's your PVC pipe. These material aggregates and concrete, as I mentioned, including glass, sometimes glass can be in there, optical fiber, and lumber. Some of these have restrictions on them. The other thing is you've probably experienced a huge increase in the cost of these materials across the board, particularly lumber, which has a direct effect on housing, construction, and rehabilitation, and all construction in general, not just us, but all industries, all construction industries, rehab, not just housing, but you can see we get into plastics, we get into aluminum. So there are some restrictions there. Buy domestic and deal with the increased cost and the restrictions on all these things. No wonder some of these products are skyrocketing in cost or unavailable between pipeline issues and then these federal requirements coming down. For those using federal funding, it's going to affect all the federal contractors. It's going to, including us as federal funding recipients. So there's a lot of pressure out there from the federal government put on states and put on tribes and put on federal funding recipients across the board, nonprofits, et cetera, that, you know, they're having these restrictions put on them for domestic purchases and restriction on some of these other items. Here's another one, telecommunication. And this is something that directly came out of the relationship with the Trump administration with China. And here it is. It has not gone away. And that is, but it's focused on a couple things. One, telecommunications. And they're very specific here with telecommunications. They include audiovisual equipment, survey equipment, low voltage cable, those, and the installation of such things. There's, you know, the purchase of some of these items and services, if using federal funds, if they are from Chinese companies, it is forbidden. You can't do it. The regulations in 2 CFR Part 200 even take it to the next level. Let's see, I don't have it here, but they literally, it's deeper into the regulations. It's deeper into 200.216, where they literally name names, and they're all Chinese companies. Literally, they are all Chinese companies. So you just need to be aware of that. Know where your material is coming from, especially when it comes to telecommunications, surveillance, audio-visual equipment, that type of thing. Here's where the domestic comes in. Now, I think we all realize that there's nothing you can do when some of the parts, just like automobiles, are manufactured or assembled in different countries, and then they come to the United States to be put together, to be assembled in a plant. There's, you know, what control do you have over that? It's just something that you need to be aware of. And this is more, from my standpoint, more geared for your internal controls, your policies and procedures that you
Hey,
understand.
Vince?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, before you get any further, Viola had a question, and her
Okay.
question was, has there been discussion about this applying only to new construction and not on rehab?
Not that I'm aware. As far as I know, it applies across the board, new construction and rehab. I'm not aware of it being singled out to new construction. So it just, you need to just be aware of these restrictions that are out there. Like the buy domestic that I was talking about a moment ago is a recommendation. It's not a hard, fast law at this point. This one, on the other hand, audio visual, telecommunications, video surveillance, and the parts that come with it, low voltage cabling, service agreements, that type of thing for these Chinese companies. Now that is a flat out mandatory restriction. The other ones, not so much. They're a little looser. But as far as I know, they apply to new construction and existing housing as well. So something we need to be aware of. Very, very aware of. Good question. Very excellent question. All right, those are the two I wanted to point out. Those are the two executive orders that trickled down through the Trump administration into the Biden administration. They ended up in the OMB and it's still there in its most recent version. It's still there. Hopefully they'll go away or they'll loosen up as time goes on. But right now, I think as federal funding recipients of the Indian Housing Block Grant, you need to be aware of them and have your internal controls, your policies and procedures, recognize that and have processes that say in effect, you will do your best to always purchase domestic where possible, something to that effect. And, you could even mention this executive order, this stipulation in your internal controls, saying you recognize it's there and we will do the utmost by and large, day to day, to make sure that we are purchasing domestics to the best of our ability. What they use for the term reasonable assurance. As you're going through 2 CFR Part 200, you're going to see the phrase reasonable assurance, which means basically you're doing the best that you can do, for the good of the organization and to meet the law and the regulations that are stated. So with reasonable assurance, you're doing the best that you possibly can do to buy domestic where possible and to be aware of restrictions that apply, particularly in audiovisual, etc., in that particular area. Okay, that would be my recommendation there. Sounds like someone opened up their microphone with it. Okay, let's move on. Subpart A, 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance has 6 subparts, A, B, C, D, E, and F, that so does the other regulation, but they're different. Now, subpart A, these days, I say these days because it wasn't always this way. Subpart A is dedicated to acronyms and definitions, and they all fall under 200.1. And there's several, go through it. There's several. I think in this presentation, I just want to pull out a few to show you because a lot of them are simplistic and redundant, but I just want to point out a few of them. I'm sure you all know what a budget is, but based on federal requirements, this is the definition of a budget. It means a financial plan for the federal award that the federal agency approves during the federal award process. I'm sure you know as well as I do that your budget is much more comprehensive than that, most likely, and has a lot more detail, and that's fine as long as you understand. This is a new area. I want to point this out because it didn't exist a couple years ago, a reference to computing devices. And that's because of the explosion of our smartphones that we use. Our smartphones are not just phones. In fact, a lot of people don't even use them as phones these days. They use them for everything else. They use them as a search engine, they use them for web access. They use them as a calculator. They use them for other things other than a traditional telephone. And they've included now OMB in its 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance has now included computing devices in there, which means machines used to acquire, store, analyze, process, publish data and other information electronically, such as our smartphones, including accessories and the peripherals that go with it, which could be a software system, which could be printing devices or scanners and all the other peripherals that go with it, transmitting and receiving devices, storage capacity, all those kind of things are now considered computing devices. And in the blue, you can see a computing device is considered a supply. This is a new definition too, as well, supply, not supply itself, but the dollar amount. Computing devices like our smartphones are considered a supply if the acquisition is less in a single purchase is less than $5,000 regardless of its useful life. It doesn't have to be 50 years like you saw before. The difference is they may, and you'll see this later on because they distinguish between supply and equipment even more detail. Basically, supplies have that $5,000 threshold, which means that a supply is considered by the federal government to be a perishable item, not like food, but a perishable item. It has a short shelf life, relatively short, compared to equipment. Equipment has several ways to look at it. It could be more than $5,000, which obviously a vehicle would be, or front-end loader, or a facility. They're all more than $5,000, and a facility wouldn't be considered equipment, but a vehicle could be a front-end loader, a plow, anything that is, if it's more than $5,000, it could be considered equipment. Now, equipment is more sophisticated than a supply. Like I said, supply has a perishable, short shelf life. It's gone within a certain period of time. Equipment, on the other hand, you'll see this as you're going through the document, has more things associated with it. It's looked at and referred to on a deeper level because it has a slower longer shelf life theoretically, and it has other financial things tied to it, like depreciation. Your vehicles, you're probably aware, your car, everything, trucks, all of that, heavy equipment, they depreciate in value. So there's money assigned to them that is either considered an asset or a depreciation of the asset. And equipment falls into that category. So there's more accounting processes assigned to equipment. You need to know the difference. There's supplies. So the win here is that they've expanded the definition of supplies basically to include a lot more. And that's great because supplies, you don't have nearly the same amount of accountability, financial and accounting accountability as you do with equipment. So that's the big difference there. More on supplies, the $5,000 threshold, including the computing devices. Yes, equipment, we just talked about that. Next section is B. Oh, by the way, to finish up subpart A, you need to go through. I put what up, 6 or 7. There's probably 30 of them. Most of them are redundant. Most of them you're familiar with. But go in there and learn the language, learn the phrases that are used. Most of them are very straightforward. But you need to know the difference. What do they mean between an compensation and fringe benefit, for example? That is highly defined in this section when we get to it a little later on. There's a lot of information on compensation, and they're all pretty much allowable expenses, but there's also a whole lot of information on fringe benefits. And to be honest with you, that's where some of the unallowable expenses lie, in fringe benefits, because there's all kinds of creative things out there from employer to employer to employer that could be considered a general allowable benefit, or could go beyond reason and be unallowable. That has more definition yet to come. I'll get into that in a few minutes as you bear with me here.
Vince,
Question, Wista? Yes?
real quick, I saw
Yep.
Wes had their hand up. Did you have a question, Wes?
Maybe not.
Hi, no, we're well past that area, so we can go ahead and go on.
Okay. All right, let's do that. All right. Purpose. Now we're into subpart B, which gets in basically the general provisions. All right. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. You can go through. It's pretty straightforward. B is not a big area. B and C are not big areas combined, but 2 CFR Part 200, 100 gets into the purpose. 112, here it is again in more detail. Now, I just have a little paraphrase here of 200, 112 conflict of interest. You need to go in and look in more detail, look at the regulations, specifically 2 CFR Part 200, 112, to see if there are any more specific examples that they quote. I'm not aware of specific examples. Regulations usually don't contain specifics. Those are reserved for your internal controls and your policies. So this is typical. There's not a lot discussed when it comes to conflict of interest other than you need to avoid it. So that's 112 in subpart B. You need to get familiar with that. And you need to get familiar with mandatory disclosures too. There's certain, which means there are points, if you're receiving Indian housing block grants, there are certain triggers that require you to notify the funder, in this case HUD, if there are certain things you want to do or certain things that happen. For example, technically a change in your budget, a dramatic increase in your budget or reduction in your budget more than, I think they quote 10% in this document, requires a disclosure to the funding source to tell them such. Same thing with a big turnover of key employees. That's another trigger. There are also other mandatory disclosure things in here. If you want to be a model activity program that I mentioned early on, remember I talked about that in the NAHASDA area, then that's a mandatory disclosure. You've got to basically notify and ask permission and justify the reason why you want to go in that direction, why you want to be a model activity program. There are several others, and they're mentioned in more detail as you progress through the regulations. Okay. So that's it. A lot of B is just general information. C, pretty much the same general information. It's called, subpart C is called pre-federal award requirements and contents of the federal award. Subpart C, by and large, pertains to the funding agency. So, like HUD, most of the information that's in here pertains to the funder and not as much to the recipient. But we'll go through it real quick and I'll pull out some, well, that's it. They're really, subpart C is just all that. It pertains more to the guidelines that the federal agency has to follow. Like I mentioned before, the one guideline that they have is data-driven, more and more data-driven reports and processes. That's an obligation that they have, and it's defined in subpart C. It's stuff like that, that we are the end user. It comes to us as a request from our funding agency. It's not a requirement that we have to abide by directly. So that's part C. Where we really get into the nitty-gritty is where we move into subparts D, E, and F. And this is what we talked about on Thursday of last week during that webinar session, which went over 90 minutes itself. And there were a lot of good questions. This is where we get into internal controls, policies and procedures more in depth. This is where we get into procurement in more depth. This is where we get into allowable and unallowable expenses. That's subpart E. And subpart F is where we get into audits. So you really need to take a look at D, E, and F and make sure that you understand the areas right off the bat in subpart D, which is what I refer to the 300s. So it's 2 CFR Part 200.302. So right out of the gate, this one and the next one, 302 and 303, talk about, and they don't say much. That's the crazy thing about these regulations. They carry the most weight but they don't have a lot of verbiage. 302 talks about financial management, and really all it says is that the non-federal entity, the NFE, that's us, the recipients of federal funding, Indian Housing Block Grant, needs to have a financial system in place. It doesn't tell you how to do it. It doesn't give you generally accepted accounting principles. It doesn't give you any guidelines. You just need to have it. So you need to understand the rest of the, as Paul Harvey, those of us of a certain age remember Paul Harvey, as he used to say, there's more to the story. You need to understand all of the regulations yet to come in this document, and you need a good understanding of what we just talked about in the 24 CFR Part 1000 and in the NAHASDA regulations, and you need to understand the operation of your organization to be able to do any of this, to create any type of financial management. It's required, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. Same thing with the next one here, internal controls. 303, very next one, doesn't say a whole lot here, a little bit more, but not a whole lot. So let's just go over it. The non-federal entity needs to establish and maintain effective internal controls over themselves, basically, with, there's that phrase, reasonable assurance, okay, which means, you know, you're doing the best you can do, that the NFE is managing the award, the federal award, in compliance with all the statutes, the regulations, the terms, the conditions, the best practices, etc., and be able to do these important things. One, evaluate and monitor their compliance. Also, in that same bullet, I would say evaluate and monitor using self-monitoring to be able to evaluate your compliance. Second bullet, take prompt action when necessary for non-compliance. Hopefully that never happens because of what you're doing in the first bullet, making sure everything's in place. And lastly, as I mentioned or alluded to before, safeguarding PII, the personally identifiable information, and doing everything you can do. So those safeguards need to be built into that, into this internal controls. Let me see, it's on the next one. No. I'm going to stay here for a minute. This is probably one of the most important areas of all the federal regulations, and that's being able to understand the legislation and all of the regulations and all of the moving parts and the operation of your entity well enough to be able to put internal controls in place for operation, financial, and compliance. And put them in place and be able to monitor them, you know, put them in place, be able to enforce them, then be able to monitor and evaluate them so that you do not run into that second bullet, a non-compliance issue. You certainly don't want to be in that position when the auditors come in and, you know, come to you with or have discussion about what they refer to as a finding. You don't want to be in that situation. So we want to have internal controls. That's why it's fundamental to know how this all fits together. Okay, enough said on that. And by the way, we could do a whole program on internal controls. There are such things, and it's a multi-day, it's at least 2 days to go over a dedicated program on internal controls that under NAHASDA. You can do that. It's very, very informative from my standpoint, and practical, and you need to have that kind. Here we're just touching the surface on it because there's just so much other stuff. Program income is talked about in subpart D. Program income is allowable, generally speaking. It's an allowable process. They encourage you to generate, even using Indian House Grant funds, to generate what they refer to as program income being generated from the use and operation of the Indian Housing Block Grant. It's allowable in most cases, depending on what you do. Of course, what you do has got to relate back to the Indian Housing Block Grant itself. Okay, 307 gets into encourage and earn income to defray costs where appropriate. It's just more definition, more clarification on program income. So that's an area to bone up on. 307 program income. The next couple slides I want to put in front of you is talking about, now we're getting into procurement. There are different, what they refer to as the small purchase, which I'm going to make an educated guess in that a lot of this one in the next slide, a lot of tribal entities have small purchases or very small purchases. I hear a camera open. Is there a question? If not, I'll keep going. Got a lot of material to cover. Okay. Keep in mind that what the federal government considers to be what they call a small purchase is $250,000 or less. Now, my educated guess is that most tribal entities, by and large, probably a huge percentage of their expenditures within a calendar, within a fiscal year, program year, are going to be less than $250,000 per item. I can't imagine a whole lot of items out there other than maybe a brand new front end loader, you know, maybe that would cost that kind of money. But keep in mind that the Office of Management and Budget, when they put these federal requirements together, all contractors, all entities that receive federal funds are required to do this. So small purchase to them is $250,000. Okay. They, you know, they're funding, imagine the funding that's going to the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, and we're talking millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions. So in that regard, a small purchase could be $250,000. But from our standpoint, as a tribal entity or an organization that supports a tribe, this is a, you know, the $250,000 is probably going to be the bulk of your expenditures, less than $250,000. So the point I'm getting to is they give some definition between what they refer to as a micro purchase and a small purchase. And then they go into other types of purchases. Let's see. You have to go into the next one. But before I go into sealed bids, I want to tell you my suggestion here when it comes to procurement, no matter what the cost of the item is or series of items, is that you use a competitive process, that you use a procurement process for all of your purchases, whether it's for in the office, paper clips for the office, or items, you know, lumber or whatever for construction or renovation or whatever it is, regardless of the cost, that you use a competitive bid process. That is my recommendation, so that your internal controls are simplified. Your policy and procedure for procurement is standardized. No matter what the cost is, you're going to follow a procurement process, and you're going to, you know, a competitive bid process with a few exceptions. And what would those exceptions be? The first one would be a sealed bid. It is a competitive process. It's usually used for construction when you're trying to solicit a general contractor, for example, for a construction or rehabilitation job. A lot of times tribes, a lot of entities will use a sealed bid process where it's just that the bid goes out and the contractor submits something that is sealed, whether it's 3 or 33 contractors submitting a bid, they're all opened at the same time. There is a process for that that is defined here. It's not anything unusual. It's a sealed bid process. You can read about it here in 200.320. It's straightforward. It's not used all the time. Like I said, usually it's reserved for construction related purchases. The one that before I get to that, I wanted to talk about the one that's most commonly used. It's in this area also in 200.320. It's just not on the screen here. And it's the one that, there's two more actually. The one that comes after the sealed bid is referred to the competitive process. And that's probably where 95% of your purchases, of your process, your procurement process should live, through the competitive process where you get bids that are submitted. Typically it's 3. Some organizations go for more, some go for 2. You know, as long the regulations don't tell you how many, they just say you can use the competitive process. My advice to you with the competitive process is to pick something, whether 3 bids, and be consistent with it. Always follow the same process. It simplifies everything. Basically, forget about the de minimis, and that small one I was talking about, $250,000, and just go with the straight process of a bid process for all purchases, with the exception of maybe a sealed bid. In other words, the bulk of your procurement would be using a competitive process. And the only exception to that, other than sealed bids, would be what's referred to as a sole source. Okay, or they refer to it as a non-competitive bid, means the same thing. It's typically used in an emergency situation. It's typically used when you can't do a sealed bid, or you can't do a competitive process, perhaps because there aren't enough vendors for you to call upon or to solicit. So it works in that case. It works, acts of nature down in this neck of the woods. It could be a hurricane that rips the top off of the building. It could be a tornado if you're in the Midwest. It could be an earthquake if you're in the Pacific Northwest, et cetera. You see what I mean? An emergency situation where you need something immediately. Or as simple as there aren't just enough vendors out there to give you a competitive process. That's when we use the sole source. My recommendation from a compliance standpoint is, if you use a sole source process, AKA non-competitive, that you document that you're moving away from your standardized process of competitive bids for this particular purchase, because, and give a reason. There aren't any vendors out there, or it's an emergency, or it's an existing process that only one company makes, and we need to go back to get a replacement part. That's a sole source process. It's different from competitive, okay? So I want to point that out. It's all defined in this section, 200-320, sealed bids, competitive, sole source, and the micro and small purchases. Those 5 things are spelled out. We tend to deal on the latter 3, sealed bid, competitive, and sole source, non-competitive. Okay, enough on that. Another very, very important one, along with internal controls, is this one, 200-329, monitoring and reporting. Everybody who has the Indian Housing Block Grant, basically everyone who has federal funding, has to go through the monitoring process and reporting process, whether it's an IHP and APR, which is required. We saw that in NAHASDA, and that trickled down over to the 24 CFR Part 1000, right? But we also have it here. And this is where it gets into self-monitoring. It states that the non-federal entity must monitor activities under its federal award to assure compliance, and operation, compliance, and finance with applicable federal regulations and performance expectations with reasonable assurance, right? Now, here it says that self-monitoring needs to be, it's required, and it needs to be done on an annual basis, all right? Which means that if you're receiving the Indian Housing Block Grant, you've got to do a self-monitoring report, which you can get from HUD. You can go to HUD's website, you can download the self-monitoring report, or it's called a self-monitoring checklist. It's got 11 parts to it that cover every part of operation, every part of compliance, every part of financial activities and transactions. And you can cut and choose, cut and paste, and use the particular sections that you want to use, right? Like if you don't have housing, then you're not going to use the section on lead paint, for example, or housing in general, and you might use the other sections, all right? So you can download that and you can use it and you can tweak it to make sure that it fits your needs. My suggestion, 2 things. 1, make sure that the document you're downloading, that self-monitoring checklist from HUD, is up to date with the regulations that you see right here in front of you with this document. Be aware, and I'm not talking disparagingly about our federal agency friends, but sometimes the regulations that and the documents that they want us to use tend to be behind the curve. Sometimes they're obsolete, which means sometimes that the regulations that are stated in those documents are not up to current standards. They're not up to current guidelines. So when this comes true with the self-monitoring document, you want to make sure that when you download that document from the site, from the HUD site, you want to make sure that it's referencing the verbiage that you have in this overview and the most recent version of the 2 CFR Part 200 super circular uniform guidance, and not old regulations. Okay, it was updated. There's a version updated this year. So you definitely don't want to be using these regulations from prior years. You want to use the most recent version. Okay. The second thing is it requires you to do a self-monitoring once a year, which is submitted with your APR. If you're receiving Indian House grant funds, you're going to have to submit an annual performance report within 90 days after the end of your fiscal year, right? A self-monitoring report is to be included with that. Now, if you're only doing one self-monitoring report once at the end of the year, you're missing a lot of opportunity to go back and check and make sure that you don't have problems. You don't want to wait until the last minute and then discover that you have a discrepancy or an operation that's not running effectively. You want to be able to mitigate those problems. Who would want to send in a report that says we have a problem with our compliance, we have a problem with our payroll? No, you don't want to do that. My recommendation, best practice would be, if you can do it, do the self-monitoring, which is an internal audit, basically, that you perform quarterly, if you can, at the end of each quarter, or at least semi-annually, at least twice a year, so that you can, because there'll be internal documents. You don't have to submit those that you do quarterly, quarter 1, quarter 2, and quarter 3. Those are internal documents that you can use to gauge if you have areas that need to be fine-tuned or changed. That's what self-monitoring really is all about, to help you identify areas, weaknesses, so that you can change them, so that when you submit the real report, the final report at the quarter 4, at the end of your fiscal year, it is pristine. Everything is running effectively and smoothly with reasonable assurance that, for the good of the program, everything is correct and you can answer yes to every question. You've got all these mechanisms in place. You can only do that if you review on a frequent basis. So whether you do it or you have someone else do it, like another tribe come in, or a vendor come in and do the self-monitoring for you, that is recommended to help you identify problems so that you can have a clean self-monitoring report. That'll also help with your audit. When you have the single audit done, they're probably going to want to look at the self-monitoring report to see how you filled that out, and how you answered those questions, or if you even did it. And the answer should be yes, we did it. Not only did we do the final report, we did several of them internally to make sure that things were operating. And where we did notice a discrepancy, here's the action that we took to resolve the problem. You want to do it during your self-monitoring, not as an afterthought, not as a finding in your audit, because then if it's discovered in an audit review or program review, now you have a problem. Now you have a documented problem you're going to have to deal with, and you don't want to get to that point. Okay. Subpart E, that's it for D. Subpart E and F are left in our time remaining here. Very important part. Subpart E basically is 47 different areas of allowable and unallowable costs. I'm not going to go through every single one of them. I think I might have a few here. Reasonable things need to be, 404 talks about your costs being reasonable. That makes sense. And they need to be allowable. Allocable. Allocable is the phrase they use here, which means they need to be able to be assigned to a different cost program. You can't just go out willy-nilly and buy things that, are unjustifiable. They have to be assigned either as a direct cost or an indirect cost, but to a cost center, to something that you're doing, a program or overhead cost. If it's an indirect cost, they have to be allocable, as it's referred to here, not just random. So you've got to, you got to make sure they're reasonable. That is one of the definitions, and allocable. And the third one, of course, would be allowable. And that's, let me jump ahead here. This is where we get, this whole section here is allowable and unallowable costs. And as I mentioned, you can see there's 45, close to 50 of them here. You can find them specifically in 2 CFR Part 200, Subpart E, Cost Principles, Parts 200, 421 through 475. Now, some of them are pretty straightforward, like alcohol, lobbying. You can't spend Indian Housing Block Grant or any federal funding on lobbying activities or on alcohol. I mean, those are pretty straightforward, but you need to go through because there's some other potential expenses in here that you may not be aware of that might not be allowable given the reason you're doing them. So you want to go through, and I'm just going to touch on them as we're trying to move through this. Obviously, audit services are allowable. Now, what you're looking here in the screen, these are paraphrasing of what the allowable. A lot of these have much more detail. So you need to go into the 2 CFR Part 200, go into the 400s, 420 to be exact, and look at 421, 22, 423, et cetera, that whole block of allowable, non-allowable expenses, and take a look at them and make sure that there isn't anything there that you're doing that you are spending your money on or want to that is unallowable. The other thing that you'll notice in here, there's several things that might be allowable based on federal regulation. Let's see if I can give an example. Oh, let's start with audit services. That's a good one. Audit services is an allowable expense. Yes and no. If you read deeper into this, what you'll find is that audit expenses is an allowable cost in general, but the single audit has a specific requirement. Now, the single audit is the audit that's performed if your federal funding for a program year exceeds $750,000. If you're not familiar with that, write that down. If it exceeds $750,000 per year in your federal funding, IHBG, for example, then you need to have what's referred to as a single audit. It's a very specific audit geared towards that type of thing, federal funding. So the cost for that audit is allowable, as it says here in section 425. If you receive less than $750,000 and you still want to have a single audit, it's not allowable expense. You can't justify the cost of a single audit, the additional cost of a single audit, if you are receiving less than $750,000. Now, you can have an audit, you just can't have a single audit, that's what it's referred to, and pay the cost for it. You can't do that. So that's one you got to take a look at because they split some hairs there. But 700, and that's also more detailed in subpart F, which is exclusively on audit requirements. So audit requirement, there it is right there, 501 audit requirements. We're going into subpart F, but let me go back before I talk anymore and close out. You want to go through this section. This is just the first one, audit service. Give an example. You'll go through, most of them are straightforward. Most of them are allowable. Some of them have unallowable facets to them. Some are both, depending upon what the situation is. And some of them you look at and go, oh, they allow for travel expense. Okay, federal government says that cost for travel, as long as it's related to, what you're doing, like if this training here, if there were a fee for it, since it's related to what you do, then that cost would be allowable. If the other thing that they don't talk about is if, and you have to look at this internally, if you have the internal approval and the budget for it. It doesn't talk about your internal operation. It just says from O&B standpoint, from a federal regulation standpoint, travel expense is allowable if you're doing it, regardless of the cost, if you're doing it for items related to your mission, to your program. The other ones you want to take a look at, there's things but travel has some stipulations like airfare. You cannot, for example, you cannot use federal dollars for high-end airfare. costs, such as business class or first. Well, they don't separate business class from first class because every airline has a little bit different jargon for it. But basically what they want you to spend your travel dollar on, if you're using airfare, is standard coach type of airfare, unless you have some kind of stipulation where you, like a medical excuse, and that's an internal process. If you've got someone that needs to travel and they have a medical excuse that says they cannot sit and coach because they cannot bend their knees, that one's familiar to me, and they need to be upgraded to, you know, the next level, and they have a doctor's excuse for it, okay, then maybe you could consider that and you could justify that expense, but you would need to justify it internally because the federal regulations don't allow for exorbitant travel expenses. We're supposed to maintain our cost with reasonable cost. First class and business tend to not be reasonable in cost. They tend to be upgrades, all right? But if a passenger, a single pan, you buy a coach airline pass for one of your employees and they have frequent flyer miles and they themselves are able to upgrade themselves at no cost to you, that's different. That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about you spending your money on first class accommodations or high end accommodations. Same theory applies to everything you do here, not just travel, but everything. It's falling back on that reasonable assurance and that justifiable, allocable, allowable, reasonable. We have to keep that in mind all the time. All right. So you can go in and you can look at all the different expense items, all 47 of them, and get an idea where money is. Keep in mind that when you look at it, keep in mind that these regulations were also written for organizations that receive federal funding. So you may see some things in here that are allowable that don't pertain to Indian tribes, that pertain more to institutions of higher learning, for example, because, you know, unless you have commencement ceremonies or things like that from a school that you might have, then you might look at that and go, that's very unusual. Why that is in there? That's because institutions of higher learning receive federal funding. They don't get Indian Housing Block Grant, they get other federal funding. That's why the regulations are there. Keep in mind, these regulations are generic. They're supposed to fit all industries, institutions of higher learning, tribal entities, nonprofits, for-profits, states, regional, local government, etc. So, all right, last section of the review that I want to get into, and very, very important, audit requirements. You need to get familiar with the 500s. Subpart F is all 500s, and it talks about program reviews and audit requirements. The other subsections talked about competition, talked about self-monitoring, talked about internal controls, right? Talked about financial operations. This area gets into audit requirements, what we are responsible to do, and what the auditor or audit team is responsible to do, what we need to provide them, what their timeline is, and what happens when they find something. Hopefully they don't, because we have self-monitoring in place, we have internal controls, written internal controls, policies, and procedures in place that cover all the potential areas of weakness, right? And of operation in general, and compliance and financial, all of those things. So hopefully we don't have audit findings. Sub 501 right out of the gate says audit requirements states that the non-federal entity that expends $750,000 in federal funding per program year is required to have that single audit, okay? And that's been in place for a number of years now. It used to be 500,000. It used to be 250 as we set the Wayback Machine. That no longer exists. It's $750,000 or more of federal funding triggers the self-monitoring requirement or the single audit requirement. Frequency, typically annually has to be done. Frequency of audit states that audits required to this part must be performed annually. Now, if your tribe has some kind of special arrangement with ONB, or not ONB, with HUD, or in this case, ONAP, where they do it less frequency, that's between them and the authority, the authority there. But the federal regulations here said the default is an annual process for the review. Audit costs is the next one. It's an allowable with that caveat that I mentioned, the 750 threshold. But generally speaking, the cost of the auditor, the cost of putting either a sealed bid or a competitive process together to solicit and identify an outside auditor, if that's the route you want to take, those are allowable costs. And it says here, states a reasonably proportionate share of cost of audits. That's it. Basically, it's allowable. Auditor selection. This just goes hand in hand with the prior citation. 509, auditor selection states that the auditee must follow its procurement procedures for an allowable expense defined in 245 audit services, which means just what I said. It's an allowable expense, but you got to follow your internal processes. And if your internal process says you're going to go through a bid process or you're going to go through a sealed bid process, then so be it. You got to treat this audit process the same way you would treat other procurement. That's what it's saying. Financial statements. This is something we have to provide. We know from subsection D that 301 to be specific, that we have to have financial system in place. Doesn't tell you how, but here it says, and again, it doesn't tell you how, it just says you've got to have financial statements that indicate the auditee, that's you, must prepare financial statements that reflect the financial position as well as the results of your operation or changes in net assets and all the generally accepted accounting principles that are used to approximate cash flow and your status. Now, we're not going to go into a financial analysis. That's a whole training program in itself. How to read financial statements, how to prepare financial statements, that can be done, but that's a dedicated program. Here, it's saying that it's a requirement of the auditee, you, to have proper financial statements available for the auditor. What it doesn't say is that there are other things that need to be included and that are going to be asked for by the audit team. And that is your internal controls. They're going to ask for that in writing. They're going to want to see them in writing. Whether you have them electronically or hard copy, they're going to want to see them, and they're going to want to make sure that your internal controls match up with obviously the federal requirements that we've been going through and your actual operation. So that's the second thing they're going to look for, your internal controls policy. Third thing, probably they're going to want to meet with your people. They're going to want to meet with perhaps you and with other staff and talk to them, the players, the people who are involved in the operation. One, to make sure that they understand what they're doing. Two, to make sure they understand the role that the Indian Housing Block Grant plays in this whole process. And three, that they understand the importance of the audit and what it does and does not do. So they're probably going to want to talk to your people. My advice here is to have the first two things readily available, your financial statements, as it says here, and your internal controls ready to go. And anything that pertains to your internal controls, such as insurance documents or, anything like that. And thirdly, that you prep your people. You prep your colleagues, you prep your superiors or your subordinates, and prep them to make sure that this might happen, that they might have to sit down. They might, maybe not, maybe they do, but if they do, that they understand as best as they can what you expect the questions to be. And that's just what we talked about here: operation, compliance. Not that they need to be financial gurus, they don't need to be financial accounting people, but they need to understand the process. This is also a time where we need to tell our staff that it's just the facts. When you're talking to an audit team, an auditor, you want to make sure that your people understand that this is not the time to show our TikTok reels or build friendship. This is a business operation here. These folks are here, these auditors are here to look for discrepancies in the program. So what we want to do in coaching our staff is to make sure they understand that, not to scare them, but to coach them, to prep them to, if there are questions, that they answer the questions to the best of their ability. But this is not the time to build friendship. These are not our friends that are coming necessarily. These are people looking deeply into our program. So just the facts is what we want to tell our people or coach our people. Just provide the information that is asked, answer the question, no more than that, no less than that. So prepping people for that is important, because that information might become part of the audit, of the written audit. So we want to make sure our people are prepped, knowing what an audit is, not just it's going to happen and it's going to be done behind closed doors. No, it could involve everybody. And we want to make sure that we are prepared. The report submission, it talks about the audit must be completed. The auditors have a timeline. They have to complete the audit within a certain period of time, which gives you a little leverage as the recipient to make sure that they're moving along. And once they're done, that the report is submitted. The audit typically is submitted to what's called the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. And the federal agencies have access to that. Sometimes there's a disconnect between when that audit is filed and getting that information to the federal agency. In other words, HUD may not, or the ONAP office may not necessarily know that the audit's been finished and it's been submitted to the financial clearinghouse. There might be a gap in information there. The auditors sometimes neglect that part of communication. So we, as the recipient, need to be aware where the audit is at all times. What's happening, the results, when it'll be done, when it'll be submitted, and then once it's submitted, we get that feedback from the auditor, then notifying, double, triple checking, notifying the funding agency that it's been submitted. And hopefully it is pristine, because we don't want to get into other things. And this is what I talked about before, scope of the audit. I kind of alluded to that. They're going to follow generally accepted government auditing standards. That's what a single audit is. It is GAGAS, it says there. Generally accepted government auditing standards, which is more detailed than GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. It's a deeper level of review. All right, just so you know the jargon there. The auditor must determine whether the financial statements of the auditee are presented fairly in all material aspects. Keep in mind that phrase, material aspects, because when there's a discrepancy in material aspects, then we have a finding, and that's a negative in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. The auditor must obtain an understanding of internal controls. It is critical that the audit team understands how you operate. The last thing you want is an auditor or an audit team that doesn't know anything about tribal housing or tribal housing department or TDHE or housing in general. That is part of the part of your coaching, perhaps, of, usually when auditors come in, auditing, there's usually a pre-audit, some kind of an interview or meeting at the beginning of the audit, and then there's a closing at the end of the audit. With the pre-audit would be for you to educate your employees and staff. The pre-audit, when the audit team sits down with you before the actual audit starts, is where you can get an idea how much the auditor or audit team knows about your operation. It's also an opportunity, a teachable moment for you to make sure they understand the uniqueness, if there is a uniqueness, of your program. This is critical, because I've seen it firsthand where the auditor does not understand. They know auditing, they know accounting, but they don't know the scope of the work in detail, the part that pertains to your operation. That's where you need to make sure you ask the questions, or not be afraid to present information to make sure in a positive professional way that they understand how you operate, right? And how your relationship with the tribe and how things work, because every tribal entity is different. And you might have an audit team that's not familiar with that. This is your opportunity to make sure they're as aware of your operation as they are of generally accepted accounting principles, so that you have some peace of mind knowing that, okay, they got it. They know we're unique in this regard. So I think that's very, very helpful. This is all an educational, teachable moment when this audit team comes in. Perhaps you can do this in advance before they show up on site, which would be ideal. Coach your people separately and then have discussion with the audit team separately to make sure they understand where you're coming from and what your organization does and doesn't do. Audit findings. This is something that's talked about in the federal regs, and you never want to be here. You want to do everything within your power to avoid a finding, especially, and there's different degrees of difficulty within findings. Significant deficiencies in that second line there, material weaknesses are the kiss of death. You do not want to be in a situation where they're using those phrases in your out interview, let alone in your audit report. These are things you need to know now so that you can use your self-monitoring and your internal controls to mitigate any potential for error or findings, let alone deficiencies or material weaknesses. Those are very strong phrases in the accounting world, in the auditing world. They mean there's a problem. There's a problem here that most likely cannot be resolved during the audit or immediately after. So that's the next question. Let's see if it's on here. Okay, I'm getting to that next. The next thing, audit findings. The next thing is, hopefully with a little coaching and a little questioning on your part, you can talk to the audit team to make sure if they come across anything, that they have an open discussion with the team or with a point person, so you know what the team is. So hopefully if there's a discrepancy in a process or something, that they bring it to your attention, and hopefully they would be kind enough to say, if you can resolve this issue or justify this issue or put into effect a policy and procedure immediately, as in during the audit, that mitigates this situation, then we'll accept it and this will go away. The next step is to be able to do it after the audit closes, but before they submit the final report to the audit clearinghouse. That is the next best scenario for anything that's out of whack, for any potential findings, right? Do it on the spot if you can, but you need communication with the team to be able to do that, or immediately after, okay? That's called a manager's response, and that might be in here, but that's what it is. It's a manager's response to a potential finding. Hopefully they're small and tiny. Hopefully if they see anything, you can fix it during the audit so it doesn't show up as a finding. All right, this goes into risk. How audit, most of us basically in our programs, unless we're receiving millions of dollars, tens of millions to be exact, are considered a low risk auditee based on these standards. If you go through it, you'll see that most of us, I think they have number figures here. We'll get to it in a second, but there's actually level thresholds. We're considered low risk and high risk. We're generally considered low risk unless we have tens of millions of dollars, receiving big dollars, or most likely what would happen is there's a prior finding in a prior audit that either wasn't resolved or is not resolvable, if you know what I mean. So that automatically increases us from a low risk to a high risk. If there was a prior finding that wasn't resolved, let alone the material things, the higher levels that I talked about. So that could put us into a higher risk, which means even more scrutiny of programs. And that's also something we want to avoid. Current and prior audit experience, it says, could indicate a higher risk. That's true. Weakness in internal controls could indicate a higher risk, correct? They could look, if you don't provide them internal controls at the beginning and yet we have none, that's going to change everything. That's going to move you from a low risk to a high risk immediately, right on the spot, which means digging deeper, more questions, more review, more testing, etc. Prior audit findings, of course, would make sense that also would move you from a low risk to a high risk. We want to try to avoid all those things. If you have them in your past, then you want to do your best moving forward to try to mitigate those so your next audit comes out clean. How do you do that? You look at your internal controls, you look at your policies and procedures, you make sure they're up to speed and you're enforcing them, and you're reviewing them by using your self-monitoring process. Quarterly, if you can, monthly, if you have to make sure that your processes are effective and efficient. That's how you do it. Management decision is what I was talking about before. This is where we don't want to be. They address it here, states that the auditee must clearly state whether or not the audit finding, which we don't want to have, is sustainable, the reasons for the decision, and how you're going to do it. We don't want to get into a repayment situation. We don't want to have to make financial adjustments or take other action like lay people off, or, whatever, close programs, accept debarment or suspension. We don't want to get into that. That's worst case scenario. They talk about it here. Management decision is our input to try to justify major findings. We don't want major findings. We want to do everything physically, humanly possible to avoid that. So that's why we stress, for us that receive Indian Housing Block Grant, federal funding in general, we stress understanding the audit requirements in subpart F. Start there to know what the auditors are going to look for, so you can work backwards, so to speak, and then take a look at your program, make sure you have those mechanisms in place, internal controls, policies and procedures, self-monitoring processes that are effective and enforced. It's great to have internal controls and policies and procedures. You can have the best written policies in the world, but if you don't monitor them and enforce them when you need to, and then react to them, then you have nothing. Same thing with developing goals and strategic plans. You can have the best ones in the world, but if you don't enforce them and put them in place and revise and look at them periodically, like a self-monitoring, and adjust them, then you've got nothing. You've got a hope and a dream. And in this case, it's not going to serve its purpose. It's going to work against you. So that is my review. It's basically all three sections kind of put into a 2-hour program to give you an idea, hopefully, how those three very important documents work together. They cross-reference each other. The legislation refers to HUD's housing, 24 CFR Part 1000 housing activities. That document refers to the super circular, which, the 2 CFR Part 200. They all work in tandem. The best thing you can do is take courses like this, get familiar with these regulations, print them out to the best of your ability, or put them up on your monitor, keep them on your desktop, on your laptop, refer to them, get comfortable with them, accept them, and work with them, try to understand. You can always, and I'll tell this to you all, you can always reach out to me. You can reach out to Awista, you can reach out to Crystal, you can reach out to the Native Learning Center in general to ask specific questions if you have any. If they think it's something that I have expertise in, they'll forward the question to me. I'll do my best to answer. They have all kinds of subject matter experts at the Native Learning Center that can answer, that they can go to for specific questions in specific areas of their expertise, like what did I say? Admissions and occupancy. That's outside of my wheelhouse, but there are subject matter experts that are extremely knowledgeable about that can answer questions more very geared towards NAHASDA and some of those regulations more than my collective knowledge. My expertise comes more with the 20, as you can probably see, the 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance. I know that document inside and out and can help you there if you need it. Always there for you. But I'm to the point where I'm going to turn this back over to Awista, if she's listening, to kind of segue us into the next. Well, actually, we should take a break, I think, if you folks are up to it. A 15-minute break. Hopefully she can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, Vince. I'm here.
Okay. Does that make sense to everyone? Turn mine.
No one is responding in the chat. If anybody here would like a break, please let us know in the chat. What, either a yes or a no.
Did we answer Viola's question?
So
Viola Yachmaneff? She had a
Yes.
question? Okay,
About the new construction or the rehab?
right, correct. Okay,
Yes,
Yes.
Vince answered that
Yes.
question.
awesome. Thank you.
It looks like everybody does want a break. So you said about a 15-minute break, Vince?
Yeah, that sounds good. That sounds good. Give a bottom of the hour with that, which is a little more than 15 minutes. Is that too much or right or what?
Sounds good.
Okay. Okay. All right, we'll meet at the bottom of the hour. It's 3:30 my time, Eastern time. Okay.
Alrighty, everyone, we'll be back at 3:30 EST. I'm going to go ahead and put the materials link in the chat box one more time. Once we come back from the break, we are going to go over the worksheet A and B. On the materials link, if you click it and then you go to click the workshop A or B, you're going to see the title is going to say small business. The title is the only incorrect issue on the whole document. The rest of the document is correct. I did go ahead and email everyone the correct documents with the correct titles. But if you are using the one off of the materials link, no worry. The only difference is the title. Oh, Vince, we can't hear you.
Can you put it up? Can you put up the version of work question A without the answers?
Yeah.
Can you put that up on the screen and then we'll walk through it and then can you put up the one with the answers after that? Does that work?
Yes. You want me to do that now or when we get back from the break?
When we get back, when we get
Okay.
back, when we come back, you should have workshop A, the one questions but no answers posted.
Right.
Up on the screen.
Yes,
Oh,
I have
okay.
both documents.
Okay. Lisa, are you able to fill in the blank there in the fillable form?
I am.
Oh, good. Then I can give you the, we can talk about the answers. You can type them in. Is that okay?
Yes, and then I also have another document open with the answers.
Well, we'll do the answers. Yeah, I think what we'll do is go through them, see if they can guess them, and then I'll say the answers out loud and you can type them in. They'll be short. Cool. We'll just do it that way instead of throwing different documents up and down. Okay. Ready when you are. Hey, chance you can make that screen bigger for us nearsighted. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay.
Ready when you are.
I am ready, and it is 3:30.
Yep.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. If you are looking at the screen, you should see Workshop A worksheet. We're gonna go ahead and go over the questions and try to fill in the answers. The first question is federal legislation, Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act of 1996, NAHASDA. What selection of the legislation indicates the allowability of a model activity?
Feel free to unmute if you know the answer. Or if you could, if I don't see it on my end, but maybe Wista does, the chat box, if that's open.
Since I am sharing my screen, I cannot see the chat box.
Okay, then we'll do open mic. We'll do open mic version. If anyone knows the answer to this, what section of the legislation of the NAHASDA legislation indicates the allowability of a model activity? Anybody? Hopefully. Wow, Richard has got his hand up. You can unmute if you know. Richard?
Hi. Hello, I'm going to assume it's section 202, subsection 6.
Put that down. What's that? Good answer.
I'm sorry, it broke up. I just
Section
heard good answer.
202.6.
Section 202. Is parentheses 6 parentheses.
Sorry, it's like
There you go.
the audio is breaking up.
Oh, okay. I can repeat what they say.
M. Stacy wrote in the chat box the same thing, section 202.6.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Excellent answers. Okay. Any other observations or comments or thoughts on that first question? Obviously, people are learning how to navigate through. That's good. So let's move on to something more comprehensive. Let's move on to HUD's Native American Housing Activities, 24 CFR Part 1000. I'll go ahead with this one. What is the deadline for submission of an IHP, Indian Housing Plan, IHP? Remember I was talking about that last week and also in the recap? Can anyone provide us with an answer?
I see Richard said September 15th of each year.
Well, let's talk about that.
M. Stacy said 75 days before the tribal program year.
That's more of an accurate answer based on my, my knowledge of the IHP. IHP must be initially sent by the recipient to the area ONAP office, if you want to jot this down.
Okay. Sorry, Wes said October 18th annual.
You're getting very specific there. If you would write down for me, IHP must be sent by the recipient to the area ONAP office no
Oh.
later than to the area ONAP office, ONAP, yep, office. No later than how many days?
75
Before-
days.
75 days, correct, before the beginning of a tribal program year.
Beginning of the tribal.
Tribal program year, if it all fits, maybe it's gonna wrap. So instead of wrapping, it's not what we see. If you could take up, just delete the last words there, 75 days. Yeah. Because what we see is, it doesn't wrap. All right, yeah, just leave it at 75 days. It's 75 days before the beginning of the tribal program year. So it's written that way because anyone want to can you go to another line, or does it take you down to number 2? That takes you down to number 2. Okay, we'll just discuss it openly. Now that is correct. That's right out of the document. That's right out of 24 CFR Part 1000. And that is correct. 75 days before the beginning of the tribal program year. Now, it's my understanding that most program years start October 1st, right? So they just started 27 days ago, right? Most, but not all. So that would change depending upon the start. I know some tribes that tribal entities don't run on that fiscal year, October 1 through September 30th. Now, most of them do, but not all of them. So that's going to change the due date, right? Based on when your fiscal year starts. So if it's 75 days, so if you do start October 1st of a year, when would it be due? If it's 75 days before an October 1st start. Sometime in July, maybe somewhere around, since I didn't hear any answer, somewhere around mid-July, July 15th, somewhere in that neighborhood of the year. So for example, coming up, if you run on the fiscal year of October 1st through September 30th, next year, the next fiscal year coming up, October of 23, your IHP, wouldn't it be due somewhere around July 15-ish, somewhere in there, 14, 15, 16th, right in the middle of July for an October 1st start. Now, if your fiscal year matches up with a calendar year and you start January 1, then you kind of add some debt. It's going to be later in the year that it would be due. That's why I think people were giving exact dates there based on their fiscal year start, but it's 75 days before the beginning, assuming an October 1st fiscal year start, that would make it somewhere around July 15th that it would be due. Now, if it's like most of the IHPs I'm familiar with, that's the due date that's to the ONAP office. There probably needs to be processes in place before you even submit that. First of all, I don't think you'd want to submit an IHP just like a grant. You wouldn't want to submit it the day that it's due or the day before it's due. You want to try to get it in there before it's due. So if there's any kind of problem on their end, then you can troubleshoot, you can work it out. So I would think that you'd want to submit it before that date. Plus, there might be some approvals that have to be put in place prior to submitting it, right? Perhaps before you submit it, there needs to be discussion of a budget, an internal budget, right? You know, or even a strategic planning, and then maybe a budget that needs to be put in place. So you know how much you're spending for the upcoming fiscal year. Maybe that budget needs to be approved by a higher authority. Formally or even informally. I think with an IHP, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, it needs to have, these IHPs need to have a resolution, tribal resolution with them. So, and if that's the case, that's what I'm familiar with. If that's the case, then there needs to be, you need to work this backwards. There needs to be things put in place to get tribal council approval. There needs to be some kind of submitting process, right? There needs to, so we're going backwards here. If it's a July 15th IHP submittal date and it needs a tribal resolution, you know, when is that going to occur? May, June? You probably don't want a tribal resolution at a July meeting. So June or even May, that means your IHP needs to be put in place well before the submittal of July 15th, maybe as early as March, you know, for an October 1st start. So that, and that is stated just like that in the 24 CFR Part 1000. Does anyone have any other thoughts on that? Any comments? Going once, going twice? Okay, let's move on to the next one. The IHP formula, can it be modified? Simple as that. May the IHP formula be modified? Any thoughts on that? Or can you find anything on it? Anybody?
If you don't know the answer, does anyone want to take a educated guess? My guess, Stacy said, my guess is no, not after it has been declared.
That's probably true on that, at that end, that once it's been, and that is true. One has been determined, but prior to that, the short answer is a qualified yes, according to the regulations. Now, they don't give a lot of clarification here, but the answer is yes, as long as the modifications, and then we're talking in advance here, do not conflict with the requirements of NAHASDA, then they can be. But I have to tell you, it's written vaguely. That section is written vaguely, intentionally, because that's not something that is done on a regular basis, that contesting the formula. But she's right. Once it's determined, no, that's usually not the practice. And it would be very, very unusual. So the answer there is a qualified yes. It could happen as long as notification do not conflict with other NAHASDA requirements. So, all right, let's move on to the OMB question. OMB has 4 questions there. Let's start with number 1. OMB Uniform Guidance 24 CFR, should say Part 200, subparts A through F. We went through all of those earlier and all last week, as you recall. Subparts A through F applies to any entity that receives federal funding. I mentioned that specifically here. What citation number describes the components of internal controls? Anyone familiar enough with the 2 CFR Part 200 to be able to make an educated guess, or to go into the document now and take a look?
Andrea said 200, section 514.
Well, that would be in the audits. That's section F, and that would be audits. There might be a reference there of internal controls, but that's not the actual document. That's not the actual citation. that gives any clarification. So she's partially right. You're partially right. That is included in that in the 500s there. It's mentioned, but it's not the actual citation. You have to go to an earlier subsection to find it.
Samuel said 200, 303.
There you go. Winner, winner. That's exactly right. It's in the 300s. It's in the 300s, which is section C, right? Subpart C, where they talk about competition, internal controls, financial requirements. And if you look, yeah, it's 200. What you want to do is 200.303.
Okay.
Go back to take out, yeah, it's 200.303. And the name of it is internal controls, the name of that citation. And remember, as I was talking about, they don't give a whole lot of definition there. Again, it's vague. So what do we do when the federal requirements are intentionally vague in giving us direction of what we need to do? Any thoughts? Anybody have any input? How do we deal with vague or even, I dare say, poorly written or intentionally written references to something without a lot of detail? Any thoughts in the chat box? Anyone want to open up their mic and give me an idea as compliance people or managers or whatever, how do we deal with regulations that don't give us a lot of insight, but we know we need detail. We need to have internal controls.
Samuel said contact EWONAP office for guidance, and Stacy said refer to program guidance.
There you go. Okay. Yeah, program guidance as in other documents that could from those offices. Yes, those are two good resources. So the answer there was after 200-303, you could say research and refer to other resources, including just put that in research, researching other resources as were mentioned, the ONAP office and other publications, and also really getting, as I mentioned before, really getting familiar with these three documents in particular: the NAHASDA legislation, the 24 CFR Part 1000, and the 2 CFR Part 200. Getting to know, it's kind of like what is not written there is in everything else. So you've got, someone mentioned something in the audit section. Yes, you need to be familiar with subpart F of the 2 CFR Part 200 to know what the audit requirements are, because they do refer in that section to internal controls. But the only way that you can do this to satisfy that mandate to have internal controls is to get your head wrapped around all these different regulations from beginning to end. Going through a course like this is a good start, to get, where do I search for these things? How do I navigate? How do I find things? Because at some point, I or my team has to sit down and put this all together, because that's the other thing. Where the federal regulations are vague, the onus is on us as in the recipient of the funders, us as the compliance people, us as the managers, directors, executive directors. We are responsible for putting together our internal controls, our internal policies and procedures. So as much as we can garner, much as we can glean from this legislation and regulations and understand it, we put it together. And that's 90% of the battle, is being able to understand this and then putting it, somehow converting it from this nebulous information into readable format. Having it in writing is 90% of the battle. Being able to understand it and put it down, pen and paper, or finger and typewriter, or finger and keyboard, and putting it down into writing is 90% of the battle. To be able, as long as we have documentation of it, you know, that is a major part. We can always tweak it later. So it's something, it's also internal controls and policies and procedures you can look at as kind of like living documents. They're subject to constant change. And I've seen this personally where I've gone out and people have shown me their internal controls, their policies and procedures, very proud of them, but they're 5, 6, 10, 15 years old. Things have changed. Look at the discussion we had alone on smartphones and the what's trickling down from ONB on regulations of supplies versus equipment. They get it. They're on top of these things, and we need to do the same. We need to stay on top of social media. We need to stay on top of these regulations, make sure that they're current, and do the absolute best job we can to try to understand what these regulations not only are, sometimes vague, but try to interpret them to the best of our ability. Putting them in writing is a good step, even if we know we're going to have to change them as other people look at them and digest them and figure out, you know, well, that one makes sense. This particular policy and procedure makes sense, but we're going to have to change this one because the regulations changed. It's, I guess what I'm saying here is it's an ongoing living document. It's an ongoing process. There's never a time when your internal controls are done. You know, the minute you write them, they're almost obsolete because things might change the next day. Processes change, and they should. And we need to do that. And that's why part of the reason they don't give a full answer here. 200-303, what is the citation describing the components of internal controls? How could they possibly give us all the internal controls that are needed for all of the various programs that we run? They can't. They leave that to us, to our best ability, with reasonable assurance that we're doing the right thing and we put these controls down, okay? Financial, compliance, and operation. Those are the 3 pillars. So let's move on to the next one there, number 2. That was good discussion, good points. Good points. Everyone had a good point. What citation number describes the requirements of general procurement standards? This is where we get into the 5 different, I'm focused on 3, but there are 5 different procurement standards. What is that citation number? And what is the gist of it? That would be your bonus point. You know, it's easy enough to find the citation, I think. But then how do you interpret this? Where do you fall? If you're willing to share, how do you approach it? This whole area of procurement standards. Any takers? This one's a little more complicated. Show of hands, any answers? Any guesses? Oh, good. I was able to open up my chat box here. Okay.
I've got
Yes.
nothing in the chat so far.
No, that was good. I figured out how to open my chat box here so I can see some of the answers. Yeah, great. I know you know this. We talked about it a lot, spent a lot of time on this section. Going once, going twice. All right. Oh, okay. So we put 200-318. You're
200-318.
exactly right. Something to do with OMB. Yes, it is something to do with OMB. The OMB 2 CFR Part 200 to be exact. And Samuel hit it right on the head with 200-319 is the exact reference. That's the exact citation that gets in. It's in subpart D of the super circular uniform guidance, which is post federal award requirements citation 200.318, values A through K. Remember A, well, we might not recognize them by their numbers there, or letters, but it was what they considered to be the micro purchase, or also called the de minimis, under $10,000, and then the small purchase, $250,000, which, you know, we talked about the fact that a lot of those really, what the ONB considers to be micro and small, are basically our bread and butter. You know, all of our purchases are, to the most part, are under 250,000. So all of them would be considered small. I don't think that gives us any more credibility to bypass compliance. We still need to have procedures in place regardless of the cost, even if it's micro cost, even if it's a couple dollars. We need to have a process in place that's here's the thing with compliance, it needs to be uniform, it needs to be consistent. So if you're going to put compliance processes in place, procurement process in place, you need to be consistent and across the board. And it's very difficult to have this conversation with people that don't deal with this every day. The difference between micro, de minimis, and small, 250,000, why get into all those kind of discussions that are kind of difficult to deal with? Just treat your procurement the same way and deal with the third, fourth, and fifth option we have according to the federal government. And that is the sealed bid process, which we use primarily for construction, right? The competitive bid process, which should be about 90 to 95% of your procurement, which is just that, a procurement process with probably 3 bids on everything, as much as to the extent you can. And then the last one, the sole source, or what's referred to as the non-competitive bid process. Those are the 3 real useful processes, general procurement standards that I think. And you want to go into the sealed bid process and look at those specifics about how to advertise for the sealed bid and how that process works, so you're familiar with it. That one has more details than or more fine tuning than the others. My NAHASDA doesn't have 3318. Where can I find the most current NAHASDA? Well, you're talking 2 different documents. NAHASDA is the legislation. All right, NAHASDA, you can look up NAHASDA legislation. You're not going to find 200-318 in NAHASDA. 200-318 is a reference to the uniform guidance. It's a different document. That's the 2 CFR Part 200.318. 2 separate documents. NAHASDA, the legislation. What I'm talking about here in this most recent conversation we're having right now, that is 2 CFR Part 200, the regulations. 2 different documents, okay? And we've been all along, since last Monday, we've been talking about basically 3 different documents, the legislation, and then 2 sets of regulations. But those are good observations, everybody. Okay, very, very good. So the short answer there, citation number describing general procurement is 318. 2 OMBs, 2 CFR Part 200.318. Yeah, oh, you don't even have, yeah, OMB, capital, just, yeah. 2 CFR or 200. There you go. That's the short answer, 200. Got an extra 0 in there. There you go. 2000 is a whole other doc. Okay, yeah, that's where specifically you would find the references and more detail on the process, on the 5 processes and the 3 we were focusing on. Okay, good stuff. Good stuff. Hopefully it's working for you folks too. I think this is really great. All right, number 3 of 4. Citation number describes allowable cost. What are the allowable costs for compensation? Not just compensation, fringe benefits are 2 different things. Find me, so this is actually 2 questions. The citation numbers to describe the first one, compensation, and then the citation number that describes fringe benefits. We're talking 2 different things here. 2 different things. They're treated separately. They're both allowable costs. So where would you find these? Information on payroll, basically, salary, wages, compensation in general, and its corresponding partner fringe benefits. Bonus points if you know of any other document that I've referred to in the past 5 days now that refers to anything that has to do, that would be the third part, any other document, legislation, or regulations that also pertain to compensation and fringe benefits, in addition to OMB, super circular, uniform guidance. So bonus points on this one. A three-part answer if you can. It's tough. This one's tough, but doable. You just gotta know where to look. Question comes in is compensation or wages or salary increases, is it an allowable expense using federal funds for your using your IHB? Where would you go? 200, 431. Bingo. Samuel's got it. He's got, oh, he's getting bonus points. Bonus points. Not only did he reference the OMB, that is correct. 200, 431 gets into compensation. He went on to say Davis-Bacon pocket guides. Davis-Bacon is the other legislation, and the prevailing wage regulation and HUD's guidance on Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage would be the regulations and guidance that also deals with compensation when you are working on construction or rehab that's more than $2,000 and you're using IHBG funds for it. So he gets 2 points out of 3. Davis-Bacon is correct. 200, 431 is correct. That's the compensation, and you should find something on fringe in that same neighborhood. 431. In fact, I have to look it up. It might be 432. I have to look it up myself just to be sure. I'm going to go to the Federal Register, see if I can find it real quick. That's the wrong one. Here we go. Anyone else while I'm looking? Just going to take a second for me to flip through. Time to run it out. He's absolutely right. 200, 431 is compensation. And I'm going to give him double bonus points because 431 also includes fringe benefits too. So it's a double whammy. 431 Davis-Bacon pocket guides. Well, there are two separate things there. Always the 200, 431 is in the OMB. Okay, correct. Absolutely correct. So that's in the OMB document, the 24 CFR Part 200. It also includes its compensation and fringe benefits. And then Samuel points out here Davis-Bacon, which is the legislation, right? Davis-Bacon. There are pocket guides, there are HUD's guides for Davis-Bacon legislation. But what I would put there is Davis-Bacon pocket guides / prevailing wage documents. That's where you get into the regulations that include certified payroll records and all that. So yes, bonus points for him. That's exactly right. It's referenced in the 2 CFR Part 200 and 200, 431 extensively. Look at, it's a big, that's one area that has a lot of information. There's a tremendous amount of information in 4 and 200, 431 on compensation and fringe benefits. Because if you think about it, there's a lot of variations, as I mentioned before, especially in the fringe benefits. You can get very creative. So there are some allowables and some unallowables in there. And then Davis-Bacon refers a lot to wages and salaries for basically construction, all the trades, depending upon the trade, plumber, sheet metal mechanic, carpenter, heavy equipment operator, etc., the state that they live in, or not that they live in, the state that the project is occurring in, whether that be Florida or Arizona or New Mexico, wherever, and then the county that they're in. So every county within the state. So if you have multiple projects in multiple counties, you could have different prevailing wage. Now that I said that, there's one more and 200, 430 as well, correct. There's one other variable I just want to toss out to you, and always if you can just put this in, tribally determined wages. tribally determined wages. That is another one that kind of supersedes everything. Some tribes have their own tribally determined wages for construction trades. And that, if that's the case, and they're documented, that can supersede the, it can supersede the OMB regulation if they have tribally determined wages for the trades. Not necessarily Davis-Bacon, because that's when we get into prevailing wage and you have to go by those standards. But tribally determined wages would be another option. Okay, good. It just, that opened up a whole area of how complicated that area could be and how you really need to be familiar with compensation and fringe, at least from a federal regulation standpoint. Not that you have to be an HR director or representative, but you need to know how it's looked upon by, the funding source, by OMB's 224, 2 CFR Part 200. This is not addressed in the other regulations or in the legislation, in the NAHASDA, but it is addressed when you drill down in the uniform guidance. You've got it, and of course Davis-Bacon is all about that, certified payroll records and all that. So they really get into it. We could spend a whole day talking about Davis-Bacon, getting into prevailing wage and certified payroll records and all that compliance, but that's a whole nother discussion. Leave it to say, the more familiar you are with 200-431, the better off you'll be. And the last one here in this area, what citation number describes the auditee's responsibility for audit findings and follow-up? What citation number? Bonus points if you know what section or subpart as it's referred to. There might be a couple answers to this. Look it up. The auditee, that's you, the recipient of funds, auditee's responsibilities for audit findings. Give you a minute to look that up. I will do the same, just to make sure my answer is accurate. I'm not seeing anything come up. Does anyone know the subpart? Oh, there's an answer. 511. That's in sub. Samuel, correct. That's in subpart F. Audit findings. 200-511 talks about audit finding follow-up. Also, you could put down section 508. That's another part, describes auditee's responsibilities. So 511 and 508, both are in subpart F, which is the section on audit requirements. Yeah, both of those. 200-511 and 200-508, both of them. Yep, they're both in subpart F, which is the section on audit requirements. Very good, very good. Any other comments? Any other observations for our searching here? Hopefully that's helpful in helping or forcing or however you all to look for these different citations. We can get into much more detail in searching, navigating, and interpreting regulation. We do have some time. If you want, we can go into the next area. Awista, is it possible for you to? Yes, thank you. You're reading my mind.
Already
Can you
had
make
it
the
set
screen?
up.
You're very good. Can you make the screen a little bigger? in the time that we have, let's see. In the time that we have, let's move on to the next one here, the next group of questions. This is a little more higher level search. All right. Let's scroll down a little bit if you would. Scroll down until I stop you. Keep going. I think you're going too far. Go
Too
back
far?
up towards the top. Yeah, I think you went too far. Yep, there you go. Scroll down just like it's at the bottom of your current screen. Title
That part.
24 part 1000. Yeah, you can leave it there. I'm looking at the very bottom there. Okay. Here we are again. This is a little different approach. Here the questions are at a little bit more in depth, a little bit higher level. Actually, well, in fact, I guess what I'm going to do is just go through you because the answers are here. But let's go through it. I'm looking at the bottom one there, Title 24, Part 1000, HUD ONAP Native American Housing. That's the 24 CFR Part 1000. The question is, when is a corrective action required in relation to the self-monitoring process? So if you would just scroll up a little bit so we can see that at the top of the page, maybe a little better. That's not going to work. Okay,
it's
just leave
not
it where
gonna
it's
work.
at. Yeah, that's the best
But
it can do.
it's this box right over here that he's talking about, everyone. We're talking about subpart F.
Yeah, and that's basically the answer. So I'm going to go through it because the answer is there, and that is to answer the question, when is the corrective action required in relation to self-monitoring process? The short answer here is you can find this information in subpart F, recipient monitoring, oversight, and accountability. It's specifically 24 CFR Part 1000.508. If the recipient identifies programmatic concern, what happens? That's the question actually in the document. If the recipient's self-monitoring activities, this is the answer, if the recipient's self-monitoring activities identify areas of concern, the recipient will take corrective actions, which may include and are not limited to one or more actions, but it doesn't tell exactly what those actions are. It just says you can take action to correct them, which is something you should do. And the way my point in talking about this one, this is something, the way that that's phrased, keep in mind that the 24 CFR Part 1000 is kind of written in a question answer format. So with that being said, written in a question answer format, you can actually use some of the verbiage here for your internal controls, for your policies and procedures. As it says in the short answer there, replace the word recipient with the name of your organization. So if the TDHE for example, identifies a programmatic concern, we will take during our self-monitoring activities, we will take corrective action, period. Actions will be, and this is where you need to be creative and list the actions you're going to do. There's no wrong or right answer, but you're literally taking the verbiage from the actual document. Why? Why create something from scratch when you can copy and paste some of the actual verbiage that's in the document? You see what I'm saying? Here, this is something that really could be, this is something an auditor would ask coming in, or a program review specialist saying, what are you going to do when you find something? Where is it in your internal controls? Where is it mentioned in your policies? How are you going to take corrective action if you do find something in your self-monitoring? Well, here, this is it. You can reference the subpart. You can reference the actual document, 24 CFR, subpart F, citation 1000-508, and use their verbiage. You can do that throughout. That was just one example. Let's scroll down a little bit if you would. Okay, let's pause there for a minute. Let's keep going. Or just stay right there. At the bottom there, it says on the left side, 2 CFR Part 200, uniform guidance. Okay, that's our source. Land, buildings, equipment, intellectual property, which we talked about last week quite a bit. I didn't talk about that so much today, but that's your software, your computer software programs, curriculum, things like that. Those are intellectual properties, including software, have a useful life of more than 1 year. Where can you find information on that? And there's the short answer there is into CFR Part 200 definitions. That's one place. Capital assets means tangible or intangible assets used in operations having a useful life of more than 1 year. Capital assets include land, buildings, facilities, equipment, intellectual property, including software. So that it could be an opening statement for you. And then from there, you can define specific intellectual property that you may have in your operation or other tangible assets that you have and how you're going to treat them. So that's another one. If you could scroll up a little bit. I'll keep going. Next page. Okay, hold right there. Okay. There's a nice one there on, if you look at the top left, it says NAHASDA legislation. And then the question, the second one there, are the conditions for retainage of program income what are the conditions, sorry, for retainage of program income by a funding recipient? Now, NAHASDA does talk about that, and there's the answer. Section 104. So if you're thinking about program income, you have it in a couple different places. You actually have it in the NAHASDA that says treatment of program income and labor standards. That's included in there too. Program income, authority to retain, and it goes on and talks about program income. From there, you could also quote out of the 2 CFR Part 200, where it talks about program income. It's a citation in and of itself. And then your third paragraph could be how you have program income generated within your own organization. And this is how we do it. And you use these references here as your justification for part of your internal controls, your policies and procedures specifically. I hope that makes sense. So as we're going through this, now, okay, scroll down again. We're going downwards again. Okay, keep scrolling. We talked about a couple of these things here. Keep going. We talked about land and buildings. Keep going. Okay, hold right there. Oh, you jumped over it. Go back up. It said ZTE right there. Okay, now we're back into the not the Federal Register. We're into 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance again. And there's a question there or a statement. It says ZTE Corporation is is on the prohibition list of telecommunication on video surveillance equipment. Remember, we were talking about that. Scroll down a little bit because it looks like it cut the sentence off. Okay. No, I can't quite read it, but the question is, what's the problem with this? So go back up and you can see if you would, right there. So you can see at the bottom of the screen, it said there's the reference there. If you could scroll up a little bit, it's kind of, can you? No, the other way. So we can see the bottom of the screen. There we go. Perfect. It says 2 CFR Part 200, 216. Remember, I talked about the prohibition on certain telecommunications and video surveillance. It talks specifically about surveillance and how that's prohibited of certain companies. And I said that they were mentioned specifically in that document in 200, 216. ZTE Corporation is one of those Chinese companies. There are several. And then at the bottom, it talks about the domestic preference. So you've got, again, just a reference, another reference on when it comes to audiovisual equipment, when it comes to finding, buying domestic and these prohibition on buying from certain companies. again, mentioned extensively in the uniform guidance. So I want to point that out to you. Keep rolling if you would. We'll keep going down further. Last few here. All right, right there. Hold it right there, because we're still in the 2 CFR Part 200, the uniform guidance. I want to show you or point out the one in the middle of the screen there. What is personally identifiable information, and 2, what is it to be done for its protection? Remember, I talked about that just a while ago, talked about it last week. It's something that is relatively new as a requirement in the uniform guidance, but it's becoming more and more prevalent because of fraud and theft and identity theft and other things that are, I mean, you can't go a day without hearing about identity theft, and some corporation or some list, mailing list or data list that has been breached on a company level, on a state level, on a national level. So the trickle-down effect is more and more regulations being put in place to protect data, to protect personally identifiable information. And we are the ones, as the recipients, that have to put these mechanisms in place. And I talked about that before. Here's the reference. 2 CFR part in the definitions, which is 2 CFR part 201, very beginning of the document, personally identifiable information. And I just want to talk about that and drive that one home. I know I talked a little bit about it earlier, but means information that can be used to distinguish, trace an individual's identity, which is going to be different for every organization. 2 CFR Part 200.1, protected personal identity information and protection of PII, means an individual's first or last name in combination with a variety of different identifiable things. And that could be, as I mentioned before, it could be social security number, could be driver's license number, passport number, or other personal information, marital status, divorce status, criminal record, any variety of different things. And then I mentioned biometrics, the most recent type of identity that, identification process, and the most recent type of identity theft is through my biometrics. So any of those identifiers combined with name, first and last name, you're getting into the realm of personally identifiable information. And I foresee this is something more and more prevalent in our regulations, especially in the Biden administration and other things coming down. I see this area tightening up even more, putting the onus on us as federal funding recipients to tighten up our procedures. And as you all know, social media and all of those things, those platforms are expanding exponentially. Every day there's new development in social media and different platforms that share information, and it's a wonderful thing. And it's also a scary thing, because there's all kinds of different data that's consumed in there, and we need to have real discussions with our management, with our IT people, even with our funding authorities here, ONAP and et cetera, on that whole issue. Because what's happening is more and more pressure on us as funding recipients to provide data. Remember, I talked about the Indian housing, the IHP and the APR is becoming more data driven. And federal regulations are becoming more and more performance based. You see that phrase a lot in the uniform guidance, performance based requirements. Those are the requirements that are being put on the federal agency. They're also asking those agencies to enforce more and more data-driven reports. So that's on one side of the equation. We've got the PII on the other, and that's problematic as we move forward, as technology moves forward. More and more information is being wanted to be conveyed to our funding sources. And at the same time, they're asking us to put more and more measures in place to protect that information. So this is a battle that we're having here and we need to resolve this and work on and be aware of it and put internal controls and policies and procedures in place that at least provide reasonable assurance that we can identify this information. First of all, identify what it is unique to your organization, and then educate our people that we work with and that we associate with, our vendors included, and then have mechanisms in place where only certain people can see certain information, whether it's hard copy or electronic, and that information also is conveyed in a private way to the best of our ability, knowing that we have to provide this information more and more readily, more frequently, more detail oriented to our funding sources and to everything. So it's out there. It's something that I've been concerned about for a number of years. I want to share that with you. You know, we got to be careful about this. It's I think one of the most important things out there, because yeah.
Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off, but I just wanted to make sure that Stacy's question was answered before we ran out of time. She just wanted to know if you could give examples of how TDHES administer this internally, protecting part 2.
No, PII, personally identifiable information, what we were just talking about. It's being able to, first of all, recognize, Stacy, what is identifiable within the clientele you work with. If it's housing, it could be information that they may be providing you on social security number, obviously name, address, social security number, income, marital status, family members, gender. All of those can be personally identifiable information that are unique to a TDHE, right? And probably more that you can think of that I'm not coming up with. Treat each one of those as personally identifiable information. When you start putting them together, you've got personally identified PII. So you need to come up with ways that, first of all, identify what those mechanisms are, or what those potentially are: social security number, date of birth, marital status, income, etc. Identify what they are, what is required that you need to operate your TDHE from those people. Okay, so that's the second step. Third step, you need to educate your staff on the fact that this is personally identifiable information and we need to treat it as such, given our federal regulations, in particular our Indian Housing Block Grant. And what I mean by that is this information needs to be warehoused in a way that it's protected, and not everyone can see it. So if it's hard copy, it needs to be filed somewhere that's protected, literally, probably in a locking drawer where you keep files on your clientele. And if it's electronic, you need to do the same. You need to find a way that information is perhaps limited to you as as the administrator, and you give permission to certain people to access certain things as need be. So once you identify it, once the information that you need is identified, and you can identify the personally identifiable information, then you have to figure out what you need to do, how it's used, and then what you need to do to protect it. All right. And all of that has to be in some kind of internal control, some kind of written procedure. It might be a series of procedures or policies, but that's it from a TDHE standpoint. I know you're getting information on occupancy and admission requirements, personal information from people. That's what we're talking about. And you need to be able to identify it, educate your people, and control access to it, because the feds are going to be looking for that. How do you protect this information? What is it? It's going to be different for every organization. Now that you've told me what it is, how do you protect it, and where are your policies that explain that? Hope that makes sense.
And
Okay,
Vince, I
good.
just like to add, just like to offer Stacy, if they would like a example of, for instance, what we included in our internal controls with regard to electronic security and password protection, to protect the PII, if Awista could drop her email in the chat box again, if you'd like to reach out to us, we can give you an example of what we have included in ours as well. That might be helpful to put in your policies and procedures, or if you develop your own internal control standards.
Yes, thank you very much, Georgette. Excellent, excellent.
Which
Excellent
Vince
question.
wrote, which Vince wrote in that section, so.
Thank you. Yeah, but that's a great idea. There's some real examples. That's a good one. Yeah. Very good. All right. Good question. Good answer. Good suggestion. All of your comments and suggestions have been wonderful. I'm hoping that we're at the bottom of the hour. Technically, we're supposed to, we're done basically. We've gone through all of the examples here. If you have, and I've been watching, I know all of us have been kind of watching the chat box, trying to the best of our ability, give you information. And I thank you very much for providing those concerns and questions. They've been excellent. And I hope this has been helpful to you in trying to learn better how to navigate, how to identify, how to interpret, and how to implement some of these standards. And as you can see, even from Georgette's comments about sharing an internal controls document, it's an ongoing process. It's not all about what we did last week with our webinars or today with this workshop. It's much more than that. It's ongoing. Your internal controls, your policies and procedures are living documents. This education is a living process. We're always learning. There's more. We could break out any one of these topics into a full day presentation on controls, on Davis-Bacon, on prevailing wage, on financial operations. All of those could be dedicated single task programs if you wish down the road. But, this is an ongoing process. And I have to share with you, every time we do something like this, I learn something too. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really hope that before I turn this over to Awista for closing, that we've satisfied some of your needs and some of your wants and desires for learning more about navigating and interpreting these federal regulations. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over for closing. I appreciate everyone being here today and look forward to more endeavors with you. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Vince, for today's virtual training. Truly appreciate it. And I just want to thank everyone for participating and joining us today. I went ahead and already put the survey link in the chat. Please don't forget to go ahead and fill out the survey. It really does help us out to let us know what you guys would prefer us to improve on, or what you didn't like. That way the next virtual training can be catered a little bit more to your guys' liking. So please go ahead and let us know what we can do to make you a little bit happier in your next virtual training. And once again, I truly appreciate you for joining us today. If the best way to get to know your requirements is to continue doing the practice. So if you do have the workshops, you can go ahead and try to quiz yourself or even come up with your own questions to see if you can find the citations. It is the best way to learn, is by challenging yourself. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me at awistaAtkins@simtribe.com. You can also email Vince. His email is also there, and Crystal Cedino. Truly, we appreciate you guys joining us today. Thank you.